The auction hammer fell at 7:47 on a Tuesday morning in March, and Delia Vance became the legal owner of a piece of land that the entire town of Crescent Hollow had already decided was worthless. For dollars. She had paid $4 actual dollars, 3 crumpled singles and 4 quarters counted out onto the courthouse clerk's desk, while people behind her whispered loud enough for her to hear every word. The clerk had looked at the money, then at Delia, then at the paperwork, and for a moment Delia thought he might refuse to process it, might tell her the whole thing had been a mistake. But he stamped the deed, wrote her name in the ledger, and slid the receipt across the scarred wooden counter without meeting her eyes. "Congratulations, Miss Vance. You now own Lot 47, Riverbend Edition. Good luck with that." Behind her, Marguerite Holloway laughed. It was the kind of laugh that traveled, the kind designed to carry across a room and land exactly where the speaker wanted it to land. "Someone has to buy the swamp, I suppose. Might as well be her." The other women gathered near the back of the county tax auction room made sounds that weren't quite laughter but weren't kind either, the particular noise small towns make when they're watching someone they consider beneath them make a decision they can mock for the next decade. Delia folded the deed in half, then in quarters, slid it into the inside pocket of a denim jacket that had belonged to her late husband, and walked out of the courthouse into air that still carried the last bite of winter. Her truck waited at the curb, a 1998 Ford Ranger in a color that had probably once been red but had surrendered to oxidation years ago. The passenger door didn't open from the outside anymore, so she walked around to the driver's side, climbed in, and sat for a long moment looking at nothing. The deed was heavier in her pocket than 4 sheets of paper had any right to be. For dollars. She had paid $4 for 3 acres of land that the county had been trying to unload for 6 years running, land that had gone up at auction every spring since the flood of 2019 and had failed to attract even a single bid. Until today. Until her. Reese was waiting for her at the diner where Delia worked 6 nights a week, a 12-year-old boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's tendency to sit very still when the world got complicated. He'd missed school for this, had ridden with her to the courthouse at 5 in the morning because she hadn't wanted to leave him home alone and she hadn't wanted to explain to anyone why she was bidding on the Riverbend lot. Now he sat at the counter with a glass of water and a library book, and when he saw her walk in through the front door, he stood up so fast the stool spun behind him. "Did you get it, Mom?" Delia nodded. "I got it." Reese's smile was the kind of smile that made her chest hurt, bright and immediate and uncomplicated by any of the skepticism that had colored every adult face in the courthouse that morning. He believed her. He had believed her for months, ever since she had come home from a shift at the diner with her eyes shining and said she'd figured something out, something nobody else in this town had figured out, something that was going to change their lives if she could just hold on long enough to see it through. She had not told him yet that she'd bought the land for $4. She had not told him that the clerk had laughed under his breath. She had not told him that Marguerite Holloway, the woman who ran the town's only bank and sat on every committee that mattered, had called her choice idiotic to her face 3 weeks ago when Delia had finally gathered the nerve to walk into the bank and ask about a construction loan. She had told him only that she had a plan and that the plan required patience and that he needed to trust her for a little while longer while she made it real. Janine was behind the counter wiping down the coffee station, and she looked up when Delia came in with an expression that was carefully neutral in the way that meant she had already heard about the auction. Word traveled fast in Crescent Hollow. It traveled faster than the phone lines and somehow arrived at every destination slightly embellished, slightly sharpened, slightly more useful for gossip than the original truth had been. Janine was Delia's closest friend in town, which was to say she was the only person who had shown up with a casserole after Cal died, instead of waiting for someone else to do it first. She was also the only person who had not told Delia she was making a mistake when Delia had explained what she wanted to do with the Riverbend lot. "You want coffee, honey?" "Yes, please." Janine poured it without asking how she took it, because after 3 years of working the breakfast shift together she knew. Black, 1 sugar, a splash of the cream that came in the metal pitcher and not the powdered stuff they kept in packets for customers. Delia cupped her hands around the mug and felt the heat soak into fingers that had gone cold somewhere between the courthouse steps and the truck. Reese climbed back onto his stool and opened his book, but she could tell he wasn't reading. He was listening. He was always listening. That kid. In the way children learn to listen when their world stops making sense, and they're trying to piece it back together from the fragments adults drop without realizing. "So you did it," Janine said, keeping her voice low. "I did it. For dollars?" "For dollars." Janine exhaled through her nose, a long, quiet sound that could have meant anything. She had been there the night Delia first told her about the soil. They had closed the diner together in October, rain hammering the windows, and Delia had spread a stack of printed pages across the booth nearest the kitchen and said, "Listen, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not think I've lost my mind." Janine had not thought she'd lost her mind. Janine had thought what she always thought when Delia got that specific look on her face, which was that Delia Vance had an engineer's brain and an engineer's stubbornness, and that if she said the soil report from the Corps of Engineers said something, then the soil report said it. What had the soil report said? That was the question that nobody in Crescent Hollow had bothered to ask. The flood of 2019 had been the worst in 100 years. The Little Sable River had jumped its banks on a Saturday night in April, had risen 6 feet in 3 hours, had inundated the eastern edge of town, and turned Riverbend Addition into a shallow lake that took 11 days to reseed. When the water finally went down, it had left behind a layer of silt that everyone assumed was the usual disaster silt, the kind that killed topsoil and made land useless for decades. Insurance companies had written the area off. The county had tried for 2 years to force a cleanup and then had given up. The 3 existing houses on Riverbend had been abandoned by their owners and eventually condemned. The lots had gone up for auction and nobody had wanted them. Except Delia. Because Delia had spent 3 months at the county extension office last spring reading everything she could find about the flood, and she had noticed something in the aftermath report that nobody else seemed to have noticed. The silt wasn't from the Little Sable. The silt was from somewhere upstream, somewhere much older, carried down by the same floodwaters that had drowned half the town. The Corps of Engineers had taken samples because they took samples after every major flood, and the samples had been cataloged and filed and forgotten. Delia had requested the catalog under a records request that had cost her $11 in photocopying fees and 4 weeks of waiting. The samples from Riverbend Edition showed something the summary had not mentioned. The silt was loaded with minerals. Specifically, the silt was loaded with a combination of silica, feldspar, and something the report called trace rare earth concentrations consistent with pegmatite weathering upstream of sampling zone 7. Pegmatite. Delia had spent another month in the Extension Library reading about pegmatite. Pegmatite was the mother rock of a very specific kind of deposit, and the specific kind of deposit was worth money. Not gold money. Something rarer than gold in a 21st century economy that ran on batteries and magnets and microchips. She had driven 40 miles north on a Saturday in December with Reese in the passenger seat, and a portable soil testing kit she had bought for $87 on the internet. And she had walked the edges of the Riverbend lots in 30-degree weather and taken her own samples from 6 different depths at 14 different locations. She had sent them to a commercial lab in Denver that ran agricultural tests for farmers. The results had come back on a Friday in January. She had read them 3 times, standing in the parking lot of the post office with snow melting on her shoulders, and then she had sat in her truck for 20 minutes and cried in a way she hadn't let herself cry since the morning Cal died on Route 12 with a tractor-trailer folded across his windshield. The report had confirmed what the core samples had hinted at. The silt covering Riverbend Edition was a top-layer deposit of material that contained, in mineable quantities by modern extraction standards, a particular combination of rare earth elements used in the production of permanent magnets for electric motors. The kind of magnets that went into wind turbines and electric cars and the guidance systems of every smart device manufactured on Earth. The deposit wasn't huge by global standards. A mining company wasn't going to open a pit there. But for a small-scale operation, for the right buyer, for a licensing arrangement with one of the domestic rare earth processors that had sprung up over the last 6 years because the federal government had decided it did not want to depend on China for materials essential to national defense, the Riverbend deposit was worth a number that Delia had not allowed herself to say out loud, even to Janine. Cal had been a hydrologist before he drove trucks. That was the thing nobody in Crescent Hollow remembered or had ever known, because by the time he and Delia had moved back to her hometown 8 years ago, he was driving long haul for the same freight company Delia's father had worked for, trying to save enough money for them to buy a house and put Reese in a decent school. But before that, before Reese, before the diagnosis that had eaten through Cal's mother's savings, and then their own, before the decision that a reliable paycheck with overtime mattered more than a career that had peaked at $31,000 a year, Cal had a master's degree in hydrology from Colorado School of Mines. And he had talked to Delia on their second date about how river systems moved minerals across geological timescales, how every flood was also a deposit, how the smartest geologists he'd ever worked with had made their best finds by driving to the places other people were fleeing. Delia had been 22 then, a structural engineering student who had thought she was the practical one in the relationship. She had listened to Cal talk about pegmatites and alluvial deposits, and had found it interesting the way a person finds interesting anything that another person is passionate about. 15 years later, standing in the parking lot of the post office with a soil report in her hand, she had felt Cal's voice so clearly it was like he was sitting in the passenger seat telling her she had already figured out the hard part. She just had to be brave enough to act on it. Janine refilled her coffee. "So what's next?" "Now I fence it," Delia said. "Post it. Get title insurance. Hire a licensed mineral rights attorney." "You have a mineral rights attorney?" "Not yet. I have a name. A woman in Boise. She does consulting for smallholders. I emailed her last month. She said she'd take a preliminary meeting on contingency if the samples checked out." Janine nodded slowly. "And you have money for all that?" Delia looked at her coffee. "No. What's the fencing going to cost?" $1,500 for materials if I do the labor myself. Maybe $2,000 with signs and gates. And the title insurance? $400. And the attorney? Delia's mouth twisted. She'd take a contingency on the sale, but she'll want a retainer for the research phase. $1,000 minimum. Probably more. So you need about $4,000. Give or take. And you have. Delia pulled the 4 quarters out of her jacket pocket and set them on the counter. Janine looked at them for a long moment, and then she reached across the counter and covered Delia's hand with her own. "You're going to figure this out." "I know. I mean it, Delia." "You are." Reese looked up from his book, and Delia smiled at him. It was the smile she had been practicing for 3 years, the smile that said, "We are not in trouble. We are fine. Everything is under control." He smiled back. It was his father's smile. It had always been his father's smile, from the day he was born, and it still was, even though Reese barely remembered him clearly anymore. Even though his memories of Cal had started to soften around the edges the way memories do when a child is young and a parent dies before there's been enough time to build the full shape of them in his head. She had promised him a real house. She had promised him a yard. She had promised him that when he started high school in 2 years, he would walk out the door of his own home and not the back bedroom of her sister's rented duplex where they had been living since the week after Cal's funeral, when the bank had foreclosed on the house they had been buying and the insurance settlement had gone entirely to the hospital bills Cal had been trying to outrun. She had promised him a life that was not a temporary arrangement. She had promised, and she had meant it, and for 3 years she had been figuring out how to keep the promise. The Riverbend lot was how she was going to keep it. She drove Reese home at 3. The duplex sat on the south side of town, a pair of sagging 2-bedroom units that her sister Karen rented from a landlord who had not made a repair in the 6 years since Karen had moved in. Karen worked at the pharmacy and lived with her boyfriend Pete, who was not the worst boyfriend Karen had ever had, but was not the best either. He was not violent, and he was not cruel, but he resented the 2 extra bodies in the house, and he expressed the resentment by eating everything Delia bought and leaving the bathroom in a state that required a chemical intervention to be restored to usability. Delia and Reese slept in the second bedroom, which was really more of a converted utility closet, on a twin bed they shared when it got too cold for the inflatable mattress Reese usually used on the floor. Pete was on the couch when they came in. He glanced up from his phone and made a sound that was not quite a greeting and not quite anything else. Karen was at work. Delia walked Reese back to the bedroom and helped him set up his homework on the tiny desk she had bought at the Goodwill 2 months ago, and then she went to the kitchen to start dinner. "How did the thing go?" Pete said. "Fine. You buy that swamp?" "I bought the lot." Pete laughed. It was the same laugh Marguerite Holloway had laughed at the courthouse, and Delia realized as she stood in front of Karen's refrigerator that this laugh was going to follow her around Crescent Hollow for months, possibly years, possibly the rest of her life if she was not able to prove it wrong. $4 for a swamp," Pete said. "That's a new low even for you, Delia." She did not answer. She made Reese a sandwich out of the last of the bread and the last of the peanut butter. She made herself nothing because she'd eat at the diner later. She carried the sandwich back to Reese's room and set it on the desk next to his open math textbook, and she sat on the edge of the bed for a minute and watched him work. He was working a word problem about trains leaving a station at different speeds. His handwriting was small and precise. He was a careful kid. He had always been a careful kid, but he had become more careful after his father died, as though carefulness might prevent the next disaster, as though being quiet and good and not asking for too much might make the world decide to leave them alone for a while. "Mom," he said, without looking up, "what's the lot look like?" She thought about it. "It looks like an opportunity." "That's not what I asked." She laughed, surprised. "No, it's not what you asked. Do you want to see it?" "Yeah. Tomorrow's Saturday. We'll drive out in the morning." "Okay." He kept working. She sat on the bed and watched him for another minute, and then she got up and went to work the dinner shift. The diner got busy at 6. It always got busy at 6 because Crescent Hollow had 2 restaurants and the other one was a pizza place, and people who did not want pizza and did not want to cook came to the diner. Delia worked the counter and the 3 booths nearest the register. Janine worked the rest. Frank was in the kitchen. They had been working the same configuration 3 nights a week for 2.5 years, and they moved around each other with the kind of practiced choreography that looked like nothing to customers and felt like breathing to the 3 people doing it. At 6:15, Marguerite Holloway came in. She came in with her husband Douglas, who was the town dentist, and with her daughter Becca, who was a senior in high school and had been in the same grade as Delia 20 years ago. Becca had been a mean girl in high school and had grown into a mean woman, but she had the decency to usually ignore Delia at the diner rather than engage. Marguerite had no such decency. Marguerite sat down in Delia's section on purpose, because Marguerite had made it a project for the last 18 months to remind Delia every chance she got that Delia's life had not turned out the way Delia's life had been projected to turn out, and Marguerite enjoyed the reminding. "Delia," Marguerite said, as Delia set down menus. "Congratulations on your purchase." "Thank you." "For dollars, I heard." "That's quite a deal." "It was the asking price." "Well, yes. The asking price on something nobody wants." Marguerite laughed her traveling laugh, and the 3 other booths in Delia's section went quiet, and Delia could feel everyone listening. She kept her face still. She had gotten good at keeping her face still. It was a skill she had developed over 3 years of waitressing, and she had honed it over the last 6 months as the news of her auction plans had leaked through town and become the subject of 1,000 small humiliations. She had endured them. She was going to endure this one. She was going to endure all of them until she did not have to endure them anymore. "What can I get you to drink?" "We'll have the wine list." "We don't have a wine list, Marguerite. You know that." "Oh, that's right. I forgot. A diner. Silly me." "Coffee, then. Decaf for all of us." Delia went to get the coffees. Janine caught her eye from across the room, and Janine's face said, "I can take that table," and Delia's face said, "I've got it," and Janine nodded and went back to her booths. Delia poured 3 decafs and carried them back. Marguerite was looking at the menu now with the expression of a woman who had already decided what she wanted and was pretending to consider other options for sport. Douglas cleared his throat. "How's your boy, Delia?" "He's good, Douglas." "Thank you." "In 7th grade now?" "6th. Right. Growing fast." "He is." Marguerite looked up from the menu. "I'll have the grilled chicken salad. No croutons, dressing on the side. Douglas will have the patty melt." "Becca?" "I'm not hungry. You have to eat something." "I'll have soup." "Fine. Soup." Delia wrote it down. She walked the order back to Frank. Frank glanced up through the pass-through window and saw who the order was for, and his jaw tightened in the way it always tightened when Marguerite Holloway came in, and he nodded once at Delia and went to work. Delia refilled coffees at the counter. She took an order from a new table, an older couple passing through on their way to the lake. She cleared a dessert plate. She moved. She kept moving. At 7, Marguerite's food came up. Delia delivered it. Marguerite looked at her salad with a small frown. "I said no croutons." "There are no croutons, Marguerite. There's crouton dust. Those little crumbs." Delia looked at the salad. She could not see crumbs of any kind. "It looks clean to me. I'd like a new salad, please." "Of course." She took the salad back. Frank looked at it and then at her. "What's wrong with it?" "Crouton dust." Frank exhaled slowly. He plated a new salad. He did it slowly and carefully, and when he handed it across the pass, He met Delia's eyes and said, without inflection, "One of these days." "I know." She carried the new salad out. Marguerite took it without comment. The Holloways ate. They paid with a credit card and tipped 6% and left. When they were gone, Janine came up behind Delia at the register and put a hand briefly on her back and said, "Breathe." "I'm breathing." "Good. Keep doing it." The shift ended at 10. Frank gave her a tinfoil package of leftovers for Reese. Janine walked her to the truck. The parking lot was empty except for Janine's old Civic and Delia's Ranger, and the streetlight was out at the far end the way it had been out for 8 months because the town had not bothered to replace it. Janine waited while Delia unlocked the truck. She leaned against the driver's door for a second before opening it. Janine said, "You want to come over Sunday? Bring Reese. I'll make lasagna. I'd like that. And listen, I've been thinking about the fencing." "Don't." "No, just listen. Pete's cousin runs that fence place over in Henrik. The one off the highway. He owes me a favor from when I covered for his wife's birthday last year." "Janine, I'm just saying, if you need materials, there's maybe a discount available. I can ask." Delia looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes were stinging, and she did not want to cry in a parking lot. "Okay," she said. "Ask." "I will." She drove home. Karen was on the couch when she came in, watching a crime show with the volume too low to actually hear. Pete was apparently in bed. Karen looked up and raised her eyebrows. "You look tired." "I am. Reese is asleep. Thanks for checking on him." "Of course." Karen paused. "Hey, Delaware. I heard about today." "Okay. I'm not going to say anything. Thank you. But if it doesn't work out, there's space here. For as long as you need it." "I mean that." Delia nodded. She went back to the bedroom. Reese was asleep on the twin bed curled toward the wall. She set the foil package on the desk for him to eat in the morning, kicked off her shoes, pulled the blanket up over him, and sat on the floor with her back against the mattress and her head tipped up toward the ceiling. The room was quiet except for the sound of Reese breathing. The deed was still in her jacket pocket. She could feel it there. For dollars. 2.3 acres. A plan that was either going to work or was going to be the final nail in the coffin of every dream she and Cal had ever had together. She pulled the deed out and unfolded it and looked at the legal description, which was written in surveyor's language with meets and bounds and references to plat maps filed with the county in 1973. Lot 47. Riverbend Edition. 2.3 acres. Owner of record, Delia and Vance. She refolded it, slid it back into her pocket, and finally let herself cry the way she had not let herself cry since the post office parking lot in January. Saturday morning came gray and cool. Delia made Reese oatmeal on the hot plate in Karen's kitchen because the stove was making a noise she did not want to investigate, and then they drove out to the lot. It was 6 miles east of town on a county road that turned into gravel and then into a double track through trees. The Riverbend Edition had been platted in the early 70s as part of a development scheme that had never quite materialized. 3 houses had been built. 6 lots had been sold. The rest had stayed in the developer's name until he died in 2004, at which point the land had reverted to the county for unpaid back taxes and had been sitting in county inventory ever since. The 3 built houses had been destroyed in the 2019 flood and condemned and knocked down, and now the entire addition was just flat land studded with weed trees and the occasional chunk of foundation slab that had not been worth the cost of hauling away. Delia parked the truck at the end of the gravel. She and Reese got out. The morning was quiet. A crow called from somewhere in the trees. The Little Sable River ran 50 yards to the east, low now in early spring, not dangerous. The land sloped very gently from the road down toward the river. It was unbeautiful in the specific way of places that nobody had loved for a long time. Brush, fallen branches, the orange blossom of a patch of last year's hawkweed not yet overtaken by fresh green. Reese walked ahead of her with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders hunched, and Delia watched him walk and felt something in her chest that was not quite pride and not quite grief, but had elements of both. He stopped at the surveyor's stake that marked the southwest corner of Lot 47. He turned back to look at her. "This is it. This is it." He looked around. He was trying hard, she could see, to find something worth being excited about. The land did not offer him much. It was land. It was flat. It had trees and brush and a view of a river that he couldn't really see from where he stood because of the trees. "What are we going to do with it, Mom?" She walked up beside him. She knelt down at the surveyor's stake and brushed back a handful of grass and dug her fingers into the soil. The soil was dark, almost black, fine-grained in a way that regular river bottom was not fine-grained. She held a pinch of it up in the morning light. There were tiny flecks in it, not gold, not silver, but a faint gleam of something harder than dirt. She had seen this before, under a hand lens at the extension office, when she had gone to talk to the agricultural agent about what she thought she was looking at. He had confirmed nothing. He had been polite, but vague. He had said her samples were interesting and had wished her good luck with her project. He had not told her she was crazy, which was the kindest thing anyone in Crescent Hollow had said to her about the lot all year. "We're going to build a future," she said to Reese. He looked down at the dirt in her hand. On this? I don't understand. I know you don't. I know. And I'm sorry I can't explain it all yet, because some of it I can't let anyone know about until I've got the right people helping me. But I need you to trust me, Reese. Can you do that for a little while longer?" He looked at her with his father's eyes. He looked for a long time. And then he nodded. "Yes. Good. Good. Thank you, kiddo. Now let's walk the property." They walked the property. She showed him the 4 surveyor's stakes that marked the corners. She showed him the place where the old road into the addition curved around a stand of oaks. She showed him the stretch of riverbank where the soil was darkest and the slope gentlest, where she had taken her best samples in December. She showed him the place where she wanted to put the first fence line, running north to south along the western edge, with a gate in the middle facing the road. They walked for an hour. By the time they got back to the truck, Reese's shoes were muddy and his cheeks were pink from the cold, and he was, she realized, almost smiling. It wasn't excitement exactly. It was something smaller than that, and, in a way, more valuable. It was the look of a kid who had walked a piece of land with his mother and listened to her talk about fences and gates and future, and who had decided, provisionally, to believe her. They drove into town and stopped at the hardware store. Delia wanted to price fencing on her own before Janine called Pete's cousin, because she wanted to know what she was bargaining against. Mr. Okonkwo, who owned the hardware store, was one of the few people in Crescent Hollow who treated Delia exactly the way he treated every other customer, which was to say with brisk competence and no curiosity. He walked her through the agricultural fencing aisle, quoted prices by the roll, and did not ask what she wanted it for. Delia wrote numbers down in a small notebook she kept in her back pocket. Reese drifted over to the bolt bins and spun one of the display racks, and by the time Delia had the prices she needed, he had wandered to the front counter where a flyer was pinned to a corkboard. "Mom." "What?" "There's a job on this board." She walked up behind him. The flyer was handwritten in ballpoint on a piece of lined paper and thumbtacked to the corkboard between a missing dog poster and an advertisement for piano lessons. It said, "Help wanted. Evening weekend shifts, prep and dishes. Riverside Grill, ask for Donnie. Cash or check." The Riverside Grill was a place she had not thought about in years. It sat on the north side of town, near the highway, and it was the kind of restaurant that lived on truckers and tourists and did not hire people from Crescent Hollow because Crescent Hollow generally did not want to work there. The pay would be terrible. The hours would be worse. But it would be cash. And she was going to need cash. She pulled the flyer off the board. Mr. Okonkwo looked up from the register and raised his eyebrows. "You taking that?" "I'm going to call about it." He nodded. "Donnie's all right. He'll work you hard, but he pays when he says he'll pay." "Thank you." She folded the flyer and put it in her back pocket, next to the notebook. She paid for the 2 small items she had actually come to buy, a roll of surveyor's tape and a can of orange marking paint, and walked back out to the truck with Reese. The morning had warmed a little. The sun was almost out. They drove back to the duplex, and Reese went inside to do his schoolwork, and Delia sat on the front step with her phone and called the number on the flyer. Donnie answered on the 4th ring. His voice sounded like 3 decades of cigarettes. "Yeah. Hi. I'm calling about the help wanted ad. Who gave you this number?" "It was on a flyer at the hardware store." He grunted. "Right. Forgot about that. You got dish experience?" "I waitress at the diner on Main. I can wash dishes." "You want evenings?" "Saturday and Sunday. I work the diner Monday through Friday." He thought about it. "You sound older than 18. I'm 37. Good. I don't need another teenager. You want to come in tonight and try for a shift?" "What time?" 5. "I'll be there." He hung up. She sat on the step for another minute, and then she went inside to tell Karen that she was going to be out both Saturday and Sunday nights for the foreseeable future, and to see if Karen could watch Reese those evenings for free or at least for very cheap. Karen was awake now and on her second cup of coffee. She listened to Delia explain, and then she sighed. Delaware, you're going to kill yourself. I'll be fine. 2 jobs plus the land plus a 12-year-old kid. You're going to literally kill yourself. I'll be fine, Karen. I just need a few months. 6 months at the outside. To do what? You still haven't told me what you think you're doing out there. I can't. You can't or you won't. Delia looked at her sister. Karen looked back. Karen was 3 years younger than Delia, and Karen had been the one who went off the rails in high school and had come back in her 20s and had been trying ever since to be the responsible one, with mixed results. Karen had opened her home to Delia after Cal died without being asked. Karen had taken Reese to school most mornings for the first year because Delia couldn't get out of bed. Karen was not a bad person. Karen was a person whose life had also not gone the way she'd expected it to go. I can't, Delia said. I'm sorry. I promise you I'm not crazy, and I promise you I have a plan, and I promise you it's going to work. But I can't tell you what it is yet, because if the wrong person finds out what I've got out there, they will figure out a way to take it from me before I can protect it. And I cannot let that happen. Karen studied her face. Then she nodded, once. Okay. I'll watch Reese on the weekends. But you owe me. I know I do. And Delaware. Yeah, if you ever need to actually tell me. I can keep my mouth shut. I know people don't think that about me, but I can. Delia's throat tightened. I know you can. I know. It's not about that. It's about the fewer people who know, the safer it is. Karen nodded again, and she reached across the kitchen table and squeezed Delia's wrist, and then she got up and went to take a shower, and Delia went back to the bedroom to check on Reese. He was at his desk with the library book open. He looked up. You have another job? Yeah. Saturday nights too? Yeah. Okay. Reese. Yeah? I'm sorry. It's okay. He looked back down at the book. Then he looked up again. Mom. What? I like the lot. She stood in the doorway and felt her eyes fill, and she did not let them spill over because she had promised herself she would not cry in front of him anymore, and she had been keeping that promise for a long time. Good, she said. I'm glad. I like you walking it with me. He smiled. He went back to his book. She went back to the kitchen to make herself a cup of instant coffee before her shift at the diner. The Riverside Grill was worse than she had expected and better than she had feared. The kitchen was small and loud. Donnie was 57 years old and had been running the place since 1997, and he did not talk much, but he did not yell at her either. She washed dishes for 6 hours. She came home at 11:30 smelling like fry oil and ammonia. She slept 4 hours. She woke up, fed Reese breakfast, drove to the diner, worked the breakfast and lunch shifts, came home, ate a sandwich standing over the sink, drove back to the Riverside Grill, and washed dishes for another 6 hours. She came home at midnight. She slept. She did the same thing again on Monday, minus the Riverside. By Friday of the first week, she had worked 67 hours and had cleared, after taxes and deductions, for $192. She put $200 of it into a savings account at the credit union on the south side of town. She had opened the account the week after the flood report came back in January, and she had been depositing into it carefully, slowly, in amounts that would not draw attention. The balance was now $1,340. Janine's cousin had come through. He had offered her wholesale on 200 feet of agricultural wire fencing, 4-strand, with tension posts. With tax, the total came to $911. Delia paid him in cash on a Tuesday evening, loaded the materials into the bed of the Ranger with Reese helping lift what he could, and drove out to the lot and unloaded. She spent Saturday morning with a post hole digger and a level, setting corner posts. Reese held the level. Reese passed her tools. Reese sat on the tailgate with a peanut butter sandwich when he got tired, and then he got up and helped again when he was ready. She worked on the fence every weekend morning in April. She strung the first 100 feet of wire by the second weekend. She strung the second 100 feet by the third weekend. She hung a gate on the fourth weekend. She spent $37 on a pair of no trespassing signs and a pair of private property signs, and she posted them at the gate and at the corners. She did not tell anyone in town what she was doing. She did not drive into the lot with anyone watching. She took back roads. She parked the truck at a pull-off a quarter-mile up the county road and walked the rest of the way when she was doing work that didn't require the truck. She was methodical. She was patient. She realized one morning as she was tightening the last length of wire with a fence stretcher she had borrowed from Pete's cousin, an engineer again, for the first time since she had walked away from her engineering degree 12 years ago to help Cal's mother pay for cancer treatment. On the last Saturday of April, Delia sat in the cab of the truck at the gate of her newly fenced 2.3 acres and sent an email from her phone to the mineral rights attorney in Boise. The email said, "I have completed initial property acquisition and perimeter securing. Samples confirm earlier lab results. I am ready to discuss next steps and to schedule the preliminary meeting we talked about in January. Please advise on retainer requirements and a timeline." She hit send. She put the phone down on the dashboard. She looked out through the windshield at the gate and the signs and the fence line running away to the south, and she thought about Cal, and she thought about Reese asleep at the duplex, and she thought about Marguerite Holloway laughing at the courthouse, and she thought about the $4 she had paid for this piece of ground, and she sat in the truck for a long time without moving and watched the afternoon light change on the new fence wire. Then she drove home and made Reese dinner. The attorney's office called back on the following Wednesday. Her name was Meredith Aguilar, and she had a voice like a person who had been underestimated her entire professional life and had stopped finding it funny around the age of 40. She asked Delia to walk her through the property history, the soil samples, the Corps of Engineers report, the commercial lab results, and the current legal status of the lot. Delia did. Aguilar listened without interrupting. When Delia was done, Aguilar said, "Send me everything you have, scanned, by Friday. I'll review over the weekend. If what you've described checks out, I'll take you on a retainer of $1,500 against a contingency of 12% of any licensing revenue or sale price for the mineral rights. That's lower than my standard because I like small cases, and this sounds like a small case that might not stay small. $1,500. Delia did the math in her head. She had $1,340 in the credit union and another $260 coming from this week's Riverside shifts. I can have that to you by the 15th of May. That's fine. Give me the documents first. Retainer when you can. Thank you. Thank you. I can't tell you what this means. You don't have to. I've done this work for 20 years. I know what it means. Give me the scans." Delia got off the phone. She stood in the parking lot of the diner with her phone in her hand. Janine was inside wiping down the counter. Janine saw her through the window and held up 2 thumbs in a question, and Delia held up 1 thumb back, and Janine clapped her hands together once, and Delia went back inside to finish her shift. That night, she came home after the Riverside and lay on the floor of the bedroom next to Reese's inflatable mattress, and she listened to him sleep, and she thought about how much could still go wrong. The attorney could find a problem in the documentation. The lab results could be questioned. The buyer she would eventually need to find could be unscrupulous. The town could find out what she had before she was protected. Marguerite Holloway could decide to escalate from mockery to interference. Because Marguerite Holloway was on the board of the bank and the bank held paper on half of the properties around Crescent Hollow, and Marguerite was the kind of woman who did not like being proven wrong in public. But none of that had happened yet. What had happened was that Delia Vance had bought a piece of land for $4, fenced it with her own hands, retained a lawyer, and begun the slow and careful process of turning a secret into a fortune. It was the end of April. Reese would be out of school in 6 weeks. Delia had a lawyer, a fence, a plan, and $791 left in a savings account at the credit union. She had also, she realized lying on the floor in the dark, something she had not had in a very long time. Not since Cal had still been alive, and they had still been a family in a house with a yard and a future laid out in front of them like a good road. She had momentum. She had forward motion. She had a direction. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep. Not yet. But she rested, for the first time in 3 years, with her shoulders all the way down. In the morning, she drove Reese to school. It was the last week of the month, and the buses had not been running that week because of a driver shortage, so she had been driving him every morning and picking him up every afternoon between shifts. He sat in the passenger seat with his backpack at his feet and watched the town go by through the window. Crescent Hollow in the early morning light looked almost pretty. The sun caught on the bell tower of the Methodist church and on the hand-painted sign outside Mr. Okonkwo's hardware store and on the flagpole at the elementary school where Delia herself had been a student 30 years ago. It was the kind of town that photographed well and lived hard. She loved it anyway. She had never been able to explain that to anyone, including Cal, who had thought Crescent Hollow was a punishment she was doing to herself for surviving when her parents had not. But she did love it. She had loved it since she was small. She had loved it even when it stopped loving her back. Reese got out of the truck at the elementary school drop-off. He turned back and looked at her through the open passenger window. "Mom." "Yeah, bud. Are we going to be okay?" She had been asked that question before. She had been asked it by bill collectors, and by her sister, and by Janine, and by Marguerite Holloway's barely concealed contempt, and by the county clerk at the courthouse. She had answered it in a dozen different ways. But when Reese asked it, she always answered the same way. "Yes," she said. "We're going to be okay." He nodded. He closed the door. He walked toward the school with his backpack straps gripped tight in both hands the way he had been gripping them since kindergarten, and he did not look back. She watched him go through the front doors and disappear into the building, and then she sat at the drop-off curb for another minute with her hands on the steering wheel. She was going to make it true. That was the thing she had decided, sitting in the parking lot of the post office in January, crying over a soil report. She was going to take a piece of land that the entire town of Crescent Hollow had written off, and she was going to turn it into a future for her son. She was going to do it on her own terms and in her own time, and when it was done, she was not going to rub anyone's face in it. She was not going to walk back into the courthouse and wave a check at the clerk. She was not going to sit down in Marguerite Holloway's booth at the diner and announce what she had pulled off. She was not going to become the kind of person the town had just accused her of being. She was going to stay exactly who she already was, a widow with a 12-year-old son and a diner job and a quiet, stubborn, engineer's certainty about the composition of a patch of river silt that no one else had bothered to look at. She was going to keep her mouth shut. She was going to keep working. She was going to keep showing up. And she was going to let the ground itself, eventually, in its own time, make the argument for her. She put the truck in gear. She drove back toward Main Street. The morning light caught on the old windows of the buildings and on the steeple of the Methodist church and on the rearview mirror of her 1998 Ranger, and Delia Vance drove through the town that had laughed at her with the deed to Lot 47 still folded in the inside pocket of her dead husband's denim jacket, and she went to work. The first week of May, Delia drove to the public library in Henrick on a Sunday afternoon when the Riverside Grill was closed for the owner's annual trip to see his brother in Arizona. She had not had a Sunday off since February. Karen had taken Reese to a movie matinee at the Dollar Theater in the next county over, which meant Delia had 6 hours entirely to herself for the first time in memory, and she had decided to spend them on the one piece of equipment Crescent Hollow did not have and Henrick did, which was a public scanner with a flatbed big enough to capture the Corps of Engineers maps without folding them. She paid $2 for an hour of computer time. She paid 40 cents a sheet for scans. By the end of the hour, she had scanned 73 pages of documentation, including the original 1973 plat map for Riverbend Edition, the 2019 Corps of Engineers post-flood assessment, her own commercial lab results from the Denver firm, the county tax records showing the chain of ownership back to the developer's estate, and the handwritten notes she had taken at the extension office when she was first trying to piece together what the silt really was. She uploaded them to a cloud folder she had created specifically for Meredith Aguilar and nothing else. She locked the folder with a password composed of the first letter of each word in a sentence Cal had written in the margin of a field notebook she had found in one of the boxes from their old house. The sentence was not romantic. The sentence said, "All rivers are libraries if you know how to read them." She had not used the sentence as a password to be sentimental. She had used it because it was 37 characters long and no computer on earth was going to guess it. She sent Aguilar the link. She drove home. She picked Reese up from Karen's car at the duplex and made him grilled cheese for dinner and worked the breakfast shift at the diner in the morning and did not think about the documents again for 5 days, because thinking about them did not make the attorney's review go faster and did not make any other part of her life easier. Aguilar called on the following Friday. It was 3 in the afternoon, and Delia was in the walk-in cooler at the diner counting plastic-wrapped pies for Frank's inventory, and her phone buzzed against her hip, and she stepped out into the kitchen and took the call leaning against the dishwasher. "Delia," Aguilar said, "I've got about 20 minutes. Can you talk?" "Yes." "Good. I'm going to tell you 3 things. The first thing is that the commercial lab results are solid and the core samples back them up, and if you can afford to do a confirmation run with an independent third-party assay firm, which I will arrange for a fee, We will have a documentation package strong enough to approach a buyer. That's the good news. The second thing is that I pulled the full chain of title on your lot this week, because you can't sell mineral rights or license them without clean title, and I found something that is going to require your attention. The third thing is that I found something else in the county records that you need to know about, and I want to tell you about it now, even though it is not strictly legal advice, because if I were you, I would want to know. Do you want me to go in that order? Yes. Okay. The confirmation assay will run you about $1,800. I can get the samples taken by a firm I trust out of Denver. They'll come on site. It won't be subtle. A truck, 2 people in coveralls, equipment. Anyone watching the property will see them. Delia closed her eyes. Okay. The second thing. The chain of title is clean for 60 of the last 63 years. But in 1983, the developer, Harlan Voss, filed a mineral rights reservation on the entire Riverbend addition before he platted the lots. Do you know what a mineral rights reservation is? Yes. Good. That saves me 10 minutes. Voss reserved the mineral rights to himself when he platted. He did not sell them with the lots. So when the lots that did get built on were sold to the original homeowners in 1974 and 1975, the homeowners got the surface rights only. Voss kept the mineral rights in his own name. When the houses were destroyed and the lots reverted to the county for back taxes, the county got the surface rights back. But the mineral rights, technically, stayed with Voss. Or rather, with his estate. Delia's stomach turned over. Does his estate still own them? That's what I spent 2 days figuring out. Voss died intestate in 2004. No will, no spouse, no living children. The estate went through a simplified probate because there wasn't much to it, and the residue of the estate, including the mineral rights reservation that the clerk missed, got assigned to the state of Washington as unclaimed property because Voss had been a resident of Washington at the time of his death. The state took possession in 2006. They have been holding the reservation in a dormant file ever since because no one has ever asked about it, and because the lots themselves have been worthless for most of that time. Here is the relevant fact. The state of Washington has a procedure for claiming dormant mineral rights reservations after 15 years of non-use. That window opens in 2021. We are past it. So what does that mean? It means I can file a petition on your behalf to reclaim the reservation as a surface rights owner. There's a procedure. It's technical, but it's not difficult. The petition costs $700 to file. There is a 90-day public notice period. If nobody contests, the rights transfer to you. If somebody contests, it gets complicated. But for you to have contested petitions, somebody in the state of Washington would need to know that the mineral rights on an abandoned subdivision in a Midwestern farming county were worth fighting for. And nobody knows that except you and me and a few people in Denver who are under non-disclosure agreements. Delia exhaled. Okay, file the petition. I will. Now the third thing. Delia waited. Harlan Voss was not just a real estate developer. He was also, according to obituaries I pulled from the Seattle Times archive, a well-known numismatist. Do you know what that means? A coin collector. Yes, he was a private collector. He was on the board of a regional coin society in the 1990s. He published articles in trade journals. He was, by the account of his obituary, one of the more significant private collectors of pre-1933 United States gold coinage on the West Coast. And when he died in 2004, his collection was not part of his estate inventory. His surviving professional associates were interviewed about it at the time because it was notable, and they all said the same thing, which was that Voss had moved the collection years before his death to a location he refused to disclose, and that he had told at least 2 people he trusted that he did not want the collection sold after his death because he wanted it to be found by someone who cared enough to look. Delia stared at the wall of the kitchen. Somewhere behind her, Frank was rattling plates. You think it's on the property? I have no idea if it is on the property. I have no idea if it's anywhere. It might have been melted down by someone he trusted. It might be in a safe deposit box in Spokane. It might be at the bottom of Lake Washington. I am telling you about it because Harlan Voss built the Riverbend addition and he kept the mineral rights and he owned, at one point, the specific piece of property you now own. And because when I was going through the probate file, the only personal document Voss left behind was a letter to his nephew dated 1998 that said, and I am quoting, "If you ever come looking for what I kept, start with the land that I kept for myself." That's the phrase. The land I kept for myself. I don't know what he meant. I am not telling you this as a legal matter. I'm telling you this because you bought that piece of land for $4, and because if I were you, I would want the information." Delia said nothing for a long time. The walk-in cooler was humming somewhere behind her. Someone rang the bell at the counter. Janine's voice, muffled, said, "I've got it, honey. Is there any way to know which lot was his?" Delia said, "The only house still standing on the Riverbend Plat when Voss died was Lot 47. The tax records show him paying the property tax on it personally from 1973 until 2002, 2 years before he died. The other 2 houses were owned by people he sold to. Lot 47 was his. I own Lot 47. I know you do." Delia put her free hand flat against the stainless steel of the dishwasher. It was warm. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips. "Meredith." "Yes. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. I'm going to send you the scan letter and the obituary and a list of everything I could find about the collection. I want you to go and walk that property again before you do anything else. Look at it like someone hid something on it. Take pictures. Don't dig. Don't touch any structure you find until we have talked. I am not a criminal attorney, but there are laws about abandoned property on land you own, and there are better ways and worse ways to document what you find. And if you do any of this wrong, you will lose half the value to taxes and insurance claims. Do you understand me?" "Yes." "Good. Also, pay me." Delia almost laughed. "The retainer's going in the mail Monday." "Good. Call me when you find something. Or when you don't. Either way." "Okay." Meredith hung up. Delia stood in the kitchen for another minute. Janine came back through the pass and saw her face and stopped and said, "What?" "Nothing. I'm fine." Janine watched her. She didn't say anything. She set a plate down on the prep counter and went back out to the dining room. Delia went back into the cooler and counted the rest of the pies with her hands shaking very slightly. And when she was done, she washed her face in the sink in the back bathroom and put her apron back on and finished her shift. That night, after Reese was asleep, she sat on the floor of the bedroom with her phone propped against the wall and read the obituary Aguilar had sent. Harlan Voss had been born in 1931 in Spokane, had served in Korea, had gotten a degree in civil engineering from Washington State, had made and lost 2 small fortunes in real estate, and had been described by his friends as a quiet man who loved 3 things, which were mountains, silver dollars, and land nobody else wanted. He had bought the Crescent Hollow acreage in 1971 from a farmer whose family had held it since the 1880s. He had platted it, sold 2 lots, built a small 1-story house for himself on Lot 47 in 1975, and had used it as a second home for the next 27 years. He had been buried in Spokane. The obituary mentioned no surviving family except a nephew named Charles Voss. The nephew had given a brief quote to the paper, which said, "My uncle spent his whole life looking for ground nobody valued because he thought value was a matter of patience." Delia read the line 3 times. She turned the phone off. She sat in the dark. She listened to Reese breathe. She thought about patience and about ground nobody valued, and about the specific shape of the lot she owned, and about where on 2.3 acres a man like Harlan Voss might have decided to hide a thing he wanted someone to find eventually, but not soon. She did not walk the property that weekend. Aguilar had told her to walk it and looked like someone had hidden something there, but Aguilar had also told her the assay team would be coming, and the assay team arriving on a weekend before the petition was filed would be the exact wrong kind of noise. Delia needed the town to stay bored with her. Delia needed Marguerite Holloway to keep thinking the $4 purchase was a joke that had already reached its punchline. So she kept her head down. She washed dishes at the riverside on Saturday and Sunday nights. She worked the breakfast shift at the diner the next week. She mailed the $1,500 retainer to Aguilar in a cashier's check she walked into the credit union to buy on her lunch break. She mailed a second check for $700 for the petition filing fee. Her savings account now held $182.17. Janine noticed the change in her that week. Not in a way she could point to directly. Delia still worked her shifts. Delia still smiled at customers. Delia still joked with Frank. But Janine had known Delia long enough to see the way her friend had gone quiet in a new way, a loaded way. And at the end of a Thursday lunch shift, Janine walked Delia out to the truck and said, without preamble, "What did your lawyer find?" Delia almost told her. She almost did. Janine had been the only person in the town of Crescent Hollow who had believed her from the beginning, and Janine had gotten her the fence materials, and Janine had kept her mouth shut for 4 months while Delia worked. If anyone had earned the right to know the full story, it was Janine. But Delia had promised herself she would keep the circle small until she was legally protected, and the circle of people who knew was already Aguilar and the Denver lab and herself and Reese. And Reese did not know most of it, and every additional person was a new place the information could accidentally leak. She isn't done yet, Delia said. Janine looked at her. Okay, thank you. For what? For not pushing. Janine shrugged. When it's time, you'll tell me. I'm not going anywhere. Delia got in the truck. She drove home. She made Reese dinner. She went to the riverside. She washed dishes. She came back. She slept 4 hours. She went to work at the diner. She did all of it again and again, and the days of May stacked up on each other like plates in the drying rack. And at some point she realized she had stopped counting the money she had and had started counting the days until school let out. Because school letting out meant Reese was home during the day, and she could not go to the property alone without him asking why he was not coming. She had decided, lying on the floor the night after Aguilar's call, that when she finally walked the lot looking for whatever Harlan Voss had left behind, Reese was going to be with her. Not because she wanted him to carry the weight of the secret. She did not. She wanted him to carry nothing. But because whatever was out there, if there was anything out there, he had worked for it alongside her, with his muddy shoes and his peanut butter sandwich and his willingness to hold a level in 38-degree weather. Whatever was out there belonged to them both. And if it was going to be found, she wanted him beside her when they found it. Marguerite Holloway came into the diner the second Tuesday in May. She came alone. She sat at the counter. She ordered coffee and a slice of lemon pie. Delia served her without speaking. Marguerite waited until Delia set the pie down and said, "So I hear you put up a fence." Delia said nothing. $4 for the land, Marguerite continued, in a voice loud enough to be heard by the booths. And what? Another 1,000 for fence. Is that right? You're really committed to this, Delia. I admire the commitment. Janine was watching from the far end of the counter. Frank was at the pass. Delia could feel the whole room tilting slightly toward Marguerite's voice. She set down the coffee pot. She looked at Marguerite directly for the first time in a long time. Was there anything else, Marguerite? Marguerite smiled with her mouth. Her eyes did not participate. I was just making conversation. You don't have to be defensive. I'm not being defensive. I'm working. Of course. Marguerite cut into the pie. I just think it's interesting. You know, my husband was talking to Hank Delaney at the club yesterday. Hank is on the County Planning Commission. He was saying that there have been some inquiries recently about the Riverbend edition. Some out-of-state interest. Isn't that curious? After all these years. Delia kept her face still. Inquiries how? Marguerite smiled again. Something about records requests. A law firm, I think. In Idaho. Does that sound familiar to you, Delia? I don't know why it would. No. Of course not. Well, Marguerite took another bite of the pie. If it turns out someone else is interested in that land, Delia, you let me know. The bank handles a lot of these things. We have resources for this. I'd hate to see you miss out on an opportunity just because you didn't have the right people helping you. Thank you, Marguerite. I'll keep it in mind. I hope you will. Marguerite finished her pie and paid and left an 8% tip, which was 2 percentage points better than usual, which was the way she had chosen to communicate that she knew something was happening and wanted Delia to know she knew. Delia cleared the plate. She wiped down the counter where the crumbs had fallen. She went into the back office and sat in Frank's cracked vinyl chair and put her face in her hands for 30 seconds, and then she got up and went back to the floor. She called Aguilar on her lunch break. She told Aguilar what Marguerite had said. Aguilar was quiet for a moment and then said, I was going to tell you about the records request this week. It's routine. Anyone pulling title has to submit a request, and the request goes through the county clerk. The clerk's office has to file it in the public log. Anyone who checks the public log on a given week can see who's requested what. That is a weakness of the system, and it is unfortunately not something we can work around. The bank, presumably, has been checking the log as part of its regular due diligence. That is what they do. What Marguerite told you means only that the bank now knows that an out-of-state firm has submitted a title request on Riverbend land. It does not mean the bank knows what the request is for. It does not mean the bank knows it was us. There are several other parties who could be interested in a random title pull in rural property, and unless Marguerite can connect my firm name to you specifically, which she cannot unless she calls me and asks, we are fine. What happens if she calls you and asks? I don't answer. I don't speak to her. I don't return her calls. She is not my client, and I am not obligated to tell her anything. And she won't. She'll send a functionary. And the functionary will get nothing. But Delia, we are on a clock now. I want the assay done, I want the petition filed, and I want you to look at what is on that property before Marguerite Holloway decides to make this her personal project. When can the assay team come? Next Saturday. That's 5 days. Yes. Okay. One more thing. You mentioned a cook you work with. Frank. Is he someone you would trust to be on the property while the assay team is there? I'd prefer you have a witness who is not me and who is not a lab employee. She hesitated. Yes. I trust Frank. Good. Ask him to come. Don't tell him why if you don't want to. Just ask him to be there. Okay. Delia got off the phone. She washed her face in the diner bathroom. She went back to work. She asked Frank that afternoon. Frank was scraping the flat top with a metal spatula when she walked into the kitchen and said, Frank, I need a favor. He looked up. I need you to come out to my lot Saturday morning. 8 a.m. I can't tell you why yet, but I might be able to later. I need you to just be there and watch what happens. You don't have to do anything. It might be boring. Frank looked at her for a long moment. He was 54 years old, a black man from Chicago who had moved to Crescent Hollow 22 years ago when his wife took a nursing job at the regional hospital, and he had been cooking at the diner since 2003. He was one of 3 black residents of the town. He had, over the years, developed opinions about Crescent Hollow that he mostly kept to himself, and he had a policy of not getting involved in other people's situations unless specifically invited. But he had also been the cook at a truck stop Delia's father had eaten at twice a week for 12 years. And he had been at Cal's funeral, and he had started leaving extra portions in Delia's takeout boxes the week after Cal died, and had never stopped. You in trouble? Frank said. No, I'm the opposite of in trouble. He looked at her. He nodded slowly. I'll be there. You want me to bring anything? A camera, if you have one. A real one, not a phone. I got my wife's old Canon. Bring that. He nodded once more and went back to the flat top. The assay team arrived on Saturday, the 17th of May at 7:47 in the morning. They came in a white Ford F-350 with a Colorado plate, pulling a small enclosed trailer with Denver Geological Services stenciled on the side in blue lettering. The 2 men in the truck were named Marcus and Terrence, and they were in their 40s. And they moved with the unhurried competence of people who had been doing this work for 20 years. Delia met them at the gate. Reese was beside her. Frank had parked his own truck on the pull-off a quarter-mile up and walked in, camera slung over his shoulder. Marcus shook Delia's hand and said, Pleasure, ma'am, and did not waste any more words. They unloaded a portable drill rig, a set of sample tubes, 3 buckets of labeled bags, and a GPS plotting unit. They set up at the first sampling location Delia had marked with a wooden stake 2 weeks before. Frank took pictures. He did not ask questions. He photographed the truck, the trailer, the stencils, the men's faces, the drill rig, the sample tubes going into the ground, the bags being labeled, the GPS coordinates on the plotting unit, and the time and date stamp on the small digital watch he wore on his right wrist, which he held up next to the drill rig in every 3rd or 4th photograph. Delia had not asked him to do it that way. He had decided to do it that way because he had realized, somewhere around the 3rd sampling hole, that he was being asked to be a witness, and he had decided he was going to do the job properly. The assay team worked for 6 hours. They took 42 samples from 14 different locations at depths from 6 inches to 11 feet. They packed the samples into the trailer. They shook Delia's hand again. Marcus said, We'll have preliminary numbers to your attorney by Friday, ma'am. Have a good day. They drove away. The gravel dust hung in the air for a minute and then settled. Frank lowered the camera. He looked at Delia. How much was in that silt? He said quietly. Delia closed her eyes. She opened them. She looked at him. Enough. He nodded. He didn't ask anything else. He walked back to his truck. Reese was sitting on the tailgate of the Ranger eating an apple. He watched Frank go. He looked at Delia. Mom. Yeah, that was important, wasn't it? It was very important. They brought it in a trailer. They did. He thought about that for a while, chewing the apple slowly in the specific way Cal used to chew apples. Small bites worked around the core in a rotating pattern. Then he said, The other thing you haven't told me yet. Is it more important than this? Delia sat down on the tailgate beside him. I don't know yet, she said. But there's something else, and I wanted you to be here when we looked for it. Not your grandfather. Not Janine. You. Because I think you should be the one who's with me if it turns out to be real. He nodded. When do we look? School gets out in 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks. She smiled. Yes. In 2 weeks. Okay. He went back to the apple. They sat on the tailgate of the Ranger for a long time, without saying anything, listening to the Little Sable River move through the trees 50 yards to the east, and the crow that lived in the old oak at the northeast corner of the property, calling and being answered by its mate from somewhere across the river. After a while, Delia reached over and put her hand on top of Reese's head, and he leaned into her shoulder, and they sat like that until the sun was halfway up the sky. The last week of May passed in a blur. The preliminary numbers from the Denver firm came back to Aguilar on the Friday as promised. They were higher than the original commercial lab had indicated. Aguilar called Delia at the diner on her break and said, without preamble, the deposit is richer than we thought. Your permanent magnet rare earths are in the top 3% of non-mine site alluvial concentrations the firm has ever tested. I've already begun reaching out, on your behalf and under non-disclosure, to 3 domestic processors I know by reputation. 2 have expressed preliminary interest. I cannot tell you a dollar figure yet because I do not have a dollar figure yet. But I can tell you that the dollar figure, when it comes, is going to have a lot more zeros on it than any figure you have allowed yourself to imagine. Delia closed her eyes. She was standing behind the dumpster at the diner, which was where she took private calls. The sun was baking the asphalt. Somewhere on Main Street a car horn honked. How much more? I am not going to put a number in your head that might not hold. But I can tell you that 8 figures is the floor. 9 figures is on the table. That is the universe we are in. Delia did not say anything for a long time. Delia, are you there? Yes. I'm here. I know. I know. Do not go home tonight and tell anyone. Do not change anything about your life. Continue to work both jobs. Continue to live in your sister's house. Do not drive a new car. Do not quit the diner. The closing on this kind of licensing or sale, if we get to a sale, will take 6 to 9 months. During those 6 to 9 months, any change in your pattern of behavior will cost you money. Do you understand me? I understand. Good. One more thing. Yes. The second matter. The Voss collection, if it exists. Have you looked? Not yet. Reese gets out of school Friday. Look next weekend. Take him with you. Document everything. Photograph what you find before you touch anything. If you find a container, photograph the container before you open it, and photograph the inside before you move anything out of it. I will explain later why this matters. Call me the moment you find anything. Okay. Delia. Yes. I am very happy for you. Delia pressed the phone against her ear and could not speak for a moment. Thank you, she finally said. Reese's last day of school was a Friday in early June. Delia picked him up at the front circle of the elementary school at 3:10 in the afternoon with her uniform already half unbuttoned under her jacket because she had come straight from the diner lunch shift and was due at the riverside in 2 hours. Reese climbed into the truck with his backpack and a plastic grocery bag full of the contents of his desk, which was mostly bent pencils and a few crumpled papers and a plant he had grown from a bean in science class in a paper cup. He looked tired in the way kids get tired at the end of a long year. How was it? Fine. You want ice cream? He looked at her sideways. We can't afford ice cream. We can afford ice cream today. He thought about this for a second. The Dairy Cream on the corner of Main and 4th was the cheapest ice cream in town. You could get a small cone for $1.25. It had been Reese's favorite place since he was 5 years old, and they had not been in since Cal's funeral. Not because they couldn't afford it, but because Delia had never been able to make herself drive past it without thinking about the fact that Cal used to take Reese there on Sunday afternoons while Delia worked double shifts. Okay, Reese said. She parked at the Dairy Cream. She got him a small chocolate vanilla swirl. She got herself a small vanilla. They sat at the picnic table out front, and Reese held the cone in both hands the way he had held cones when he was 5, and Delia ate her vanilla slowly and watched her son and felt, for the first time in a very long time, a kind of lightness in her chest that did not have any edges in it. Tomorrow, she said. Yeah? Tomorrow you and I are going to walk the lot. Okay. We haven't been in a while. I know. I need you to help me look for something. Look for what? Something that maybe somebody hid there a long time ago. Reese's eyes got wider. Hid? Yes. Like a treasure? She hesitated. And then she said, yes. Like a treasure. Whose? A man who used to own the land. He died in 2004. He was a coin collector. He told people once that if anybody ever came looking for what he'd kept, they should start with the land he kept for himself. And the land he kept for himself was ours. Reese stopped with the cone halfway to his mouth. Mom. Yeah. Is that what you haven't been telling me? Some of it. He thought about this. Is that why we bought the land? No. The land is valuable for another reason too. I can't explain the other reason yet, but I will when I can. The coin thing is something my lawyer found out about last month. I haven't looked yet because I wanted you to be with me when I did. Reese looked down at the picnic table. Thank you, he said. For what? For waiting. She swallowed. She had not expected him to say that. She did not trust her voice. She reached over and squeezed his shoulder. She ate the rest of her ice cream. They went out to the lot the next morning. It was the first Saturday in June. The sun was already hot at 9 a.m., and the grass in the pasture-like sections of the property had grown to knee-height in the warm weeks of May. Delia had brought a pair of brush loppers, a garden rake, a long steel probe she had bought at the hardware store for $6, 2 pairs of work gloves, 3 bottles of water, a lunch of sandwiches and apples in a small cooler, a camera she had borrowed from Frank, and a notebook to record everything. Reese had brought his own small backpack with a baseball cap, a flashlight, and a granola bar. He looked more serious than she had ever seen him look. He had been thinking about this all week. He had not told Karen what they were doing. He had not told anyone. He had, as he had been doing since he was 6, simply internalized the rule and followed it. They walked the perimeter first. Delia had been thinking about this for weeks, since Aguilar's call, and she had been trying to put herself inside the head of a 70-year-old civil engineer and coin collector who had built his own house on 2.3 acres in the mid-1970s and had, at some point, decided to hide a collection worth possibly several $1,000,000 in a place where it would eventually be found. Voss had been methodical. Voss had reserved the mineral rights quietly, decades before anyone else knew what was in the ground. Voss would not have hidden the collection in an obvious place, but he also would not have hidden it somewhere impossible to find, because he had wanted somebody to find it. He had wanted the right kind of person to find it, the kind of person who bought land nobody else wanted. The foundation of Voss's house was still visible at the center of the lot. It was a rectangular slab of concrete about 28 feet by 32 feet, cracked in 2 places by frost heave in the years since the house had been demolished, half covered in grass and weeds. Delia and Reese walked around it first. They looked for anything unusual about the slab itself, any anomalies, any patches where the concrete was different. Delia had brought the probe in case she wanted to check the depth of anything. She ran the probe along the edges of the slab at 6-inch intervals, pushing it into the soil until it hit the slab edge. The slab edge was consistent. The slab was what it appeared to be. Reese walked out beyond the slab, toward the west edge of the clearing, where a small rise in the land was topped by an oak tree that Delia had estimated was at least 100 years old. The rise had always seemed out of place to her when she walked the lot. The rest of the land sloped gently down from the road toward the river. The rise was the only significant topographic feature other than the slab. It was about 40 feet across and 3 or 4 feet higher than the surrounding ground. On top of it stood the oak and an apron of rough grass and fallen acorns, and, at the base of the oak on the north side, a small weathered concrete structure that Delia had assumed, on her first visit, was a septic tank cover. Reese stopped at the rise. Mom. What? Come look at this. She walked over. Reese was standing next to the concrete structure at the base of the oak. It was about 2.5 feet square, poured concrete, set level with the ground, with a metal plate bolted across the top. The plate was weathered and rust-streaked. Someone had painted it brown at one point, but the paint had long since flaked off, leaving just the dull orange of old steel. Delia knelt next to it. She had looked at it a dozen times over the last 6 months and had dismissed it. It was on the high ground, where a septic tank for the original house would have made sense. The bolts along the edge of the plate looked like standard service access bolts. What about it? She said. It's too small to be a septic tank. She looked at him. Septic tanks are big, he said. We did a thing at school last year about how towns work. Septic tanks are, like, big enough for a car. She looked at the plate again. She had not thought about it that way. The metal plate was 28 inches square, maybe a little more. It could have been the access hatch for a septic tank, but it could also have been the access for something else entirely, because septic access hatches were usually round and smaller, and this was square. She got the probe. She pushed it into the ground 3 feet from the edge of the concrete. The probe went in 22 inches and hit something solid. She pulled the probe out. She moved a foot closer to the concrete and pushed it in again. It hit something solid at the same depth. She moved around to the other side of the concrete, 3 feet from its opposite edge, and pushed the probe in. Solid again. Same depth. She looked at Reese. "Reese," she said, very quietly, "I think there is something down there that is larger than this concrete cap." Reese crouched beside her. His face was very serious. "What do we do?" "We photograph it first, and then we unbolt it." She took pictures of the concrete from every angle. She took pictures of the surrounding ground. She took pictures of Reese standing next to it for scale. She took a picture of the bolts. She took a picture of her own watch showing the time and date. Then she fetched the half-inch box wrench she had brought for the fence work and slid it onto the first bolt. The bolts were rusted in place. She put her whole weight on the wrench. The first bolt moved a quarter turn and stopped. She worked it back and forth. After 3 minutes, it broke free. She unscrewed it the rest of the way. There were 8 bolts in total. The second took 2 minutes. The third took 4. By the time she had the 6th unscrewed, her hands were shaking and her shoulders ached, and Reese had brought her one of the bottles of water and was holding the flashlight ready. The last bolt came out at 11:17 in the morning. Delia set it down in the grass next to the other 7. She put her hands on either side of the metal plate. "You ready?" she said. Reese nodded. She lifted the plate. It was heavier than it looked. She had to use her legs. She slid it off to the side. Cold air came up out of the hole. Under the plate was a concrete shaft, square, about 2.5 feet by 2.5 feet, dropping straight down. Set into the walls of the shaft were metal rungs. The shaft was approximately 8 feet deep. At the bottom, the shaft opened sideways into a larger space. Delia could see a concrete floor. She could see the edge of something else, just at the limit of the sunlight that reached down the shaft. The something else looked like the corner of a green metal cabinet. She looked at Reese. Reese looked at her. She handed him the camera. "Photograph me going down," she said. "Then stay up here. Do not come down until I tell you." "Mom." "Reese. Stay up here." "Okay." He hesitated. He nodded. "Okay." She turned around at the edge of the shaft. She lowered her legs in. Her boot found the first rung. She found the second. She went down, one rung at a time, into the cool dark. At the bottom of the shaft, the space opened into a chamber that was maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with a concrete floor and concrete walls and a concrete ceiling 7 feet high. It was dry. She could smell old air and faint rust. Her flashlight beam traveled across the floor and found, against the far wall, a steel cabinet the size of a filing cabinet but thicker, painted a dull green, with a heavy steel door and a combination dial set into the front. There was also, she saw as her flashlight moved, a small wooden desk pushed against the side wall, with a chair. On the desk was a stack of papers, a glass jar with several pens in it, and an old-fashioned journal bound in brown leather. The papers had been there for 22 years. The air in the chamber had been still for most of that time, and the paper looked intact, not disintegrating. She stood in the middle of the chamber. She could hear Reese breathing at the top of the shaft. "Mom," he called down, his voice small and careful. "What's down there?" She turned her flashlight toward the journal on the desk. The cover was worn. In gold letters, pressed into the leather, was a name. Harlan Voss. Below it, in smaller letters, a subtitle. Personal Record 1963 to 2002. She breathed out. She found that she had started to cry, silently, her face wet. She wiped it with the back of her hand. She called back up the shaft. "Reese, come down. Slowly. I've got you." She heard him swing his legs over the edge. She heard his sneakers find the first rung. She heard him climbing down, carefully, the way he had climbed down the ladder from the top bunk at his grandfather's house when he was 6 years old and he had not wanted to be carried. He reached the bottom of the shaft, and she put her hands on his shoulders and turned him toward the cabinet. He looked at it. He looked at the desk. He looked at the journal. "Mom," he said, "is that the treasure?" She squeezed his shoulder. "I think," she said, "that the treasure is inside the cabinet. And I think the journal will tell us how to open it. And I think Harlan Voss has been waiting for us for 22 years. She walked over to the desk. She set her flashlight down. She reached for the journal with hands that had stopped shaking, because her hands did not shake anymore when the work was real, and she opened the cover. On the first page, in a neat engineer's print, Harlan Voss had written, "For whoever you are, I am sorry I am not here to meet you. If you have found this, you are the one I hoped for." The combination to the cabinet is written at the end of this journal. But I ask you, before you open it, to read the first 5 pages. I want you to know who I was and what I was keeping. After that, the rest is yours. Delia stood in the dim chamber at the bottom of the shaft, her son beside her, 8 feet below a piece of ground that the town of Crescent Hollow had laughed at her for buying, and she turned to the second page of Harlan Voss's journal, and she began to read. The first page of the journal was dated October 11th, 1963. Harlan Voss had been 32 years old. He had just come back from a work trip to a copper mine in Arizona, and he had written, in the careful upright hand of a man who had been taught penmanship by a school that still cared about such things, that he had that afternoon purchased his first gold coin at an estate sale in Tacoma. It was a 1908 Saint-Gaudens double eagle in uncirculated condition, and he had paid $41 for it, which was more than he had ever spent on any single object in his life. He had written, "I do not know why I bought it. I know it is worth something, but I did not buy it because of what it is worth. I bought it because I held it in my hand and I felt, for the first time in my life, that I was holding something that had outlived everyone who had ever touched it before me and would outlive me as well. I have decided I would like to be a man who collects things that outlast him." Delia read the page aloud in a low voice, her flashlight propped on the desk beside the journal. Reese stood beside her with his hands in the pockets of his jeans. He was listening. He was 12 years old, and he was listening to a dead man's first entry in a journal nobody had read in 22 years. And he had the expression on his face of a kid who understood, in a way most adults did not, that he was inside a moment that would not come again. The second page was dated 2 weeks later. Voss had bought a second coin, an 1881 Morgan silver dollar, for $11. The third entry was from 6 months later. A third coin. A fourth. By the end of 1964, he had 12 coins. By the end of 1970, he had 307. The fifth page, which Voss had asked them to read, was not about coins at all. It was about a piece of land in Colorado that Voss had bought in 1969 for $6 an acre and had sold 8 years later for $400 an acre, and about what he had learned from the experience. He had written, "The principle is that most people look at land and they see what it is. They do not see what it contains, because seeing what it contains requires you to have the patience to ask the question and the humility to accept that you might not know the answer yet. The people who become wealthy are not the people who see the answer. They are the people who ask the question. I have tried to be the second kind of person. I have not always succeeded. But when I have succeeded, it has been because I was willing to buy the thing that everyone else had decided was not worth buying, and to wait, and to let the ground do its own work." Delia closed the journal partway with her finger holding the place. She set it down on the desk. Reese looked up at her. "Are you crying?" he said. "I am." "Why?" "Because I think this man and I would have been friends." He nodded. He did not say anything else. He walked over to the green steel cabinet and put his hand flat against the door. The cabinet was cold. Delia finished reading the first 5 pages. Voss described, in entries written over decades, how he had built the collection slowly, 1 coin at a time, buying only what he could afford and only what he had held in his hand. He had never bought at auction. He had never bought from a catalog. He had driven, in his long life, to 41 states to look at individual coins. He had bought a coin in 1978 from a widow in Arkansas who had kept it in a cigar box on top of her refrigerator since her husband's death in 1952. He had bought a coin in 1984 from a retired railroad engineer in Minnesota who had inherited it from a great-uncle who had worked on the Comstock lode. He had built the collection not as an investment, but as a record of a country, and he had built it with a kind of stubborn romanticism that would have embarrassed him if he had ever had to describe it to another human being, which was why, in 40 years of collecting, he had never once shown the full collection to anyone. On the last page of the first section, he had written, "In 1998, when the cancer had come back for the second time and I knew I was not going to outrun it forever, I began to think about what to do with them. I did not want them sold. I did not want them cataloged and auctioned and dispersed into the same pool of collectors I had been drawing from for 4 decades. I wanted them to remain together, and I wanted them to be found, eventually, by someone I did not know. I wanted that person to be someone who had understood, without me telling them, what I had understood. that the ground repays patience, that the thing nobody wants is often the thing that matters most, that the measure of a person is not what they take from a place, but what they are willing to plant in it and leave behind. I built this chamber in the summer of 1999 with the help of 2 men I trusted who have since died, and I moved the collection into it over the course of 3 trips. I am writing this entry in 2002, the last time I expect to come to Crescent Hollow. I am going to drive back to Spokane tomorrow. I do not think I will return. If you are reading this, then the ground has done its work and you have done yours, and I am grateful to you, whoever you are, for having the kind of eyes that see what is not yet there. Delia closed the journal for a second time. She and Reese stood in the dim chamber in silence. The flashlight on the desk threw long shadows across the concrete walls, and the air was still and dry and carried the smell of old metal and paper and, very faintly, of a cedar sachet Voss had apparently once placed in the cabinet because he had also, Delia would learn, understood that gold did not mind moisture, but the leather of coin folders did. The combination was written on the last page of the journal, as Voss had said. It was a sequence of 6 numbers. Delia turned the dial on the cabinet. Right 34, left 18, right 51, left 7, right 22, left 0. On the last number the mechanism clicked. She pulled the handle. The door swung open. Inside the cabinet were 24 wooden trays, stacked on sliding rails. Each tray held, in individually fitted velvet-lined slots, rows of coins in clear acrylic capsules. Each capsule was labeled in Voss's handwriting on a small white card inserted beneath the coin. The top tray, which Delia pulled out first with hands that were not quite steady, held 12 gold coins, all Saint-Gaudens double eagles in graded condition ranging from very fine to uncirculated, dated between 1907 and 1933. Delia did not know coin values in any detail, but she knew enough to know that a 1933 Saint-Gaudens double eagle, which she was looking at in the 6th slot, had, when one had been sold at public auction in 2021, brought a price of $18 million, and that there were fewer than 15 of them known to exist, and that the one in front of her was labeled in Voss's handwriting as specimen number 4 of the known examples, acquired 1987 from a private estate in Philadelphia. Delia sat down on the wooden chair at the desk. She put her head in her hands. Mom. Reese was standing at the open cabinet, looking at the trays. He was not touching them. He had not touched anything since they had come down into the chamber. Mom, is this a lot? She started to laugh. It came out of her as a single broken sound, and then it turned into the kind of crying she had not done since the post office parking lot in January. Except this time the crying was not despair. It was something else. It was the opposite of despair. It was the sound a person makes when the thing they have been carrying for 3 years has finally been set down, not because it got lighter, but because someone else, a man she had never met, a man who had been dead for 22 years, had walked back down a staircase of his own design to meet her at the bottom and take half the weight from her. It's a lot, she said. She stood up. She wiped her face. She walked to the cabinet. She did not touch the coins. She pulled out her phone. It had no signal down in the chamber, but the camera worked. She photographed each tray as she slid it out, one at a time, holding the phone steady. She photographed the labels. She photographed the combination dial. She photographed the desk, the journal, the walls, the ladder going up into the shaft of sunlight from above. She did what Meredith Aguilar had told her to do, which was to document everything before she moved anything. Because the difference between a treasure found and a treasure taxed at 60% and reduced to litigation over chain of custody was documentation, and Harlan Voss had left her the rest of his life's work, and she was not going to be the person who mishandled it at the end. She and Reese climbed back up the ladder at 12:43 in the afternoon. The sun was high. Delia pulled the metal plate back across the top of the shaft. She did not bolt it back down. She wanted to come back with better tools and a better plan. She laid the plate flat across the opening and covered it with the loose dirt and grass she had pulled off it that morning. She stood with her son on the rise of ground under the 100-year-old oak at the center of the 2.3 acres she had paid $4 for, and she looked out across the fenced pasture toward the county road and the trees beyond it, and she did not speak. They drove to the credit union. Delia deposited the $894 in cash she had been carrying in a small envelope in her glove compartment, which was the residue of 4 weeks of Riverside shifts, into her savings account. She did not tell the teller anything. The teller did not ask. Delia took the deposit slip, folded it, put it in her pocket, and drove Reese home. She called Aguilar from the parking lot of the duplex. Aguilar picked up on the second ring. Delia said, "I found it." Aguilar was quiet for 2 full seconds. Then she said, "Tell me." Delia told her. She described the chamber, the journal, the cabinet, the trays. She described the 1933 Saint-Gaudens. She described the inventory in Voss's handwriting on the inside cover of the journal, which she had photographed but not yet sat down to read. Aguilar listened without interrupting, and when Delia was done, Aguilar said, "Okay, here is what we do. Do not go back to the chamber this week. Do not tell anyone. Do not send the photographs anywhere except to the secure email I am about to give you. I am going to retain a numismatic authentication specialist out of New York, a woman I have worked with on 2 estate cases, and I am going to bring her out to Crescent Hollow to examine the collection in situ. She will come quietly. I will also coordinate with her an armored transport firm and a high-value insurance writer, because the moment we move anything out of that chamber, the insurance situation becomes non-trivial. This will take 3 to 4 weeks to arrange. In the meantime, you and I have a separate matter that is coming to a head, which is the rare earth deal, because I have preliminary offers from 2 of the 3 processors I approached, and I need to walk you through them. Do you have time to talk Monday evening?" "Yes." "Good. I will call you at 7. Delia?" "Yes. Do not quit either of your jobs yet." "I wasn't going to." "I know. I am saying it anyway." She got off the phone. She walked into the duplex. Karen was in the kitchen making tuna salad. Reese had already disappeared into the bedroom. Karen looked up and said, "You look like you've been crying." "Allergies." "Uh-huh." Karen did not push. Karen had not pushed in months. Delia made Reese a sandwich, ate half of one herself, washed her face, and drove to the Riverside Grill to wash dishes for 6 hours. Aguilar called Monday at 7 as promised. Delia took the call behind the dumpster. Aguilar walked her through the 2 offers. The first was a flat buyout of the mineral rights for $17 million, paid in 3 annual installments, with a rider requiring Delia to surrender surface access for a 5-year development window. The second was a licensing arrangement under which the processor would pay Delia a royalty of 7% on all extracted material, with a guaranteed minimum of $1,200,000 per year for 10 years, with surface access negotiated separately, and with the mineral rights remaining in Delia's name. Aguilar recommended the second. It was more complicated, it carried more risk in the early years, but it retained the asset in Delia's name, and it was very likely, based on the extraction rate projections, to pay out significantly more over the life of the deposit than the flat buyout. How significantly? Over 15 years, conservatively, $42 to $58 million. Before taxes. That is the licensing option. The buyout is 17. You are leaving, conservatively, $25 million on the table if you take the buyout. You are also, however, taking a simpler deal with less risk, and you are getting your first check faster. Delia stood behind the dumpster in the dark and looked at the sky. The stars were out. Crescent Hollow did not have much in the way of streetlights, and the sky above the alley behind the diner was, on a clear night in early June, the kind of sky she had not really looked at since she was a child. She could see the shape of Ursa Major. She could see, low on the southern horizon, a planet that was probably Jupiter. "Meredith," she said. "Yes. Cal and I used to talk about this." "About what?" "About what we would do if we ever had enough. Enough that it wasn't about surviving anymore." He said he wanted something that would last. Something that would still be paying out when our grandchildren were grown. He said money you spent was gone, but money that was built into the ground would keep working after you were dead. Aguilar was quiet. "I'll take the licensing deal," Delia said. "Good. That is the right answer. I will negotiate terms. The first royalty payment, based on the processor's extraction schedule, will be due 11 months after closing. We will close in October, most likely. You will receive your first payment, approximately $100,000 as an upfront signing advance against royalties, within 2 weeks of closing. $100,000. Yes, that is more money than I have ever had at one time in my life. I know. Delia, listen to me. You are going to be all right. I am not going to let you make mistakes with this. I have seen people wreck themselves with windfalls. You are not going to be one of them. I know. Get some sleep. I will. Delia hung up. She stood behind the dumpster for another 5 minutes. Then she went back inside and washed the rest of the dinner rush's plates. She did not tell anyone. She did not tell Janine. She did not tell Karen. She did not tell Frank. She did not even fully tell Reese, because the shape of what was coming was still abstract, and she had promised herself she would not put the weight of it on his 12-year-old shoulders until the weight was real. She continued to work both jobs. She continued to live in the converted utility closet at Karen's duplex. She continued to drive the 1998 Ranger. She continued to eat sandwiches standing over the sink. The numismatic specialist from New York arrived on the 24th of June. Her name was Dr. Patricia Lund, and she was 61 years old and wore her gray hair in a braid down her back and had the unhurried manner of a person who had spent 40 years looking very closely at small objects and had developed, in that time, no patience whatsoever for the performance of expertise. She flew into the regional airport in Henrik on a Tuesday morning, and Aguilar picked her up in a rented sedan, and the two of them drove out to the lot where Delia was waiting with Frank and Reese. Frank had asked, when Delia asked him to come, whether this was the same kind of thing he had witnessed before, and Delia had said, "It's related but different," and Frank had said, "What time?" and had shown up at 7 a.m. with his wife's cannon and a thermos of coffee. Dr. Lund went down the ladder. She spent 4 hours in the chamber. She came up once, at noon, to drink a cup of coffee and eat a granola bar and blink in the sunlight and say, in a quiet voice to Aguilar, "I have never seen a private collection of this quality and unbroken provenance in my career." Then she went back down. She came up for the final time at 4 in the afternoon. She climbed out of the shaft slowly, the way a person climbs out of a place they are not ready to leave. She took off her gloves. She walked over to the tailgate of Delia's Ranger, where Aguilar and Delia and Reese and Frank were sitting, and she set a small notebook down on the tailgate and opened it. "I have preliminary values," she said. "These are my own estimates. They will need to be confirmed by a second specialist, and the final numbers will depend on auction conditions if any of these are ever sold, which I understand is not necessarily your plan. But you asked me for a preliminary number, and a preliminary number is what I have." Aguilar nodded. Dr. Lund looked at Delia. "The collection contains 472 coins. The majority are United States gold coinage from 1795 to 1933, with particular concentration in the Saint-Gaudens and Liberty Head double eagles. There are 61 silver coins of significant numismatic value, including a complete set of Morgan dollars with the key Carson City mint marks, several in uncirculated condition. There is a single gold coin not of United States origin, a 1787 brasher doubloon, which I have examined under magnification and which I believe to be authentic. I will need to consult with a colleague at the American Numismatic Society before I am willing to stake my reputation on that. But if it is authentic, which I believe it is one of 7 known specimens. The last one sold at auction brought $9.36 million. That is one coin." Delia said nothing. "The 1933 Saint-Gaudens," Dr. Lund continued, "is the coin that concerns me legally more than financially. There are complex questions about private ownership of 1933 double eagles, because the Treasury Department has historically taken the position that most of them were never legally released from the mint. That is a legal matter for your attorney. But as an object, and putting aside any legal encumbrance, it would, if it could be sold at public auction, bring somewhere between $15 and $22 million depending on conditions." Aguilar made a note. "The balance of the collection," Dr. Lund said, "excluding the brasher and the 1933 Saint-Gaudens, I would value at a conservative aggregate of $38 million at current market." Delia sat very still on the tailgate. Dr. Lund closed the notebook. "So a conservative total, with the 2 headline pieces fully included at market value and setting aside the 1933 legal questions, is approximately $62 to $69 million. A more aggressive valuation, assuming a well-managed dispersal through a major auction house over a 2-year period, could reach $80 million. That is my preliminary estimate. I will provide you with a written appraisal within 30 days. Frank, sitting on the tailgate with his thermos in his hand, exhaled through his teeth in a long, low sound. He did not say anything. Reese, sitting beside Delia, reached over and took her hand. He held it in both of his. He did not look at her. He looked at the fence line running away to the south. Delia finally spoke. "Dr. Lund." "Yes. How long did it take Harlan Voss to build this?" 39 years. Delia nodded. I would like, she said, to keep it together. Dr. Lund looked at her for a long moment. I thought you might, she said. That makes certain things easier and certain things harder. We can talk about it when you're ready. Thank you. Aguilar stood up from the tailgate. All right. I am going to coordinate the armored transport. The collection will move to a secure vault in Chicago within the next 2 weeks, under insurance. Dr. Lund, thank you. Frank, thank you for being here. Reese, young man, you are going to have a very interesting summer. Delia, call me Friday. Aguilar drove Dr. Lund back to the airport. Frank got in his truck and nodded to Delia and drove away without saying anything. Because Frank had always understood that the right thing to do at an important moment was often to leave so that the people who needed to have the moment could have it without an audience. Delia and Reese sat on the tailgate of the Ranger. Reese said, Mom, that was a really big number. It was. Is it real? It's real. Like, we're rich now. We are going to be. It's going to take a while. But yes. Reese looked down at his sneakers. They were dusty. He was wearing the same sneakers he had worn every day for 15 months. Because his feet had finally stopped growing for a minute and Delia had not been able to justify buying new ones. He was quiet for a long time. Mom. Yeah, I don't want to stop going to my school. Delia turned and looked at him. Why did you say that? Because I thought maybe rich people send their kids to other schools. And I like my school. My friends are there. I don't want to go to a different one. Delia put her arm around him and pulled him against her shoulder. We are not going anywhere, she said. We are going to stay in Crescent Hollow. I am going to buy us a house, a real one, with a yard. You are going to go to the same school and see the same friends and play on the same baseball team. That is the whole point. That has always been the whole point. Okay. Mom. Yeah. Can we fix up the foundation? What foundation? Where Harlan's house used to be. Can we, rebuild something there? I don't mean a house. But could we make it a place? Because he wanted it to be a place. And we found it. Delia stared out at the slab. It sat in the middle of the property, cracked and overgrown, 28 feet by 32 feet. A place where a man had lived for 27 years and had, somewhere in that time, dug a shaft into the ground beside his house and built a room for the thing he had loved. We can build whatever you want there, she said. What do you want to build? I don't know yet. Okay. They sat on the tailgate a long time. The sun began to move west. At some point, Reese said, I'm hungry. And Delia drove him to the Dairy Cream and bought him a small chocolate vanilla swirl and herself a small vanilla, and they sat at the picnic table out front and ate them slowly, and Delia did not cry, because the time for crying had, for now, passed. The town found out gradually. It did not find out all at once, because Aguilar had been careful and Delia had been careful, and the people who knew kept their mouths shut. But there were too many moving pieces for it to stay buried forever. The armored truck that came to move the collection at the end of July could not be entirely invisible, even though it came at 5 in the morning on a Sunday and used an unmarked trailer. The mineral rights closing in October was a matter of public record, and Crescent Hollow, for all its sleepiness, had a courthouse and a records clerk and a network of people who checked the filings on a weekly basis, because gossip was a currency in a town that did not produce much else. The signing advance from the rare earth processor hit Delia's credit union account on October 19th. It was $108,200, and she transferred $90,000 of it into a second account Aguilar had set up for her at a bank in Minneapolis, because Aguilar had said, bluntly, the people at your credit union are not going to be able to keep their mouths shut about a deposit of that size, no matter how much they like you, and it is better to let them gossip about a small deposit than a large one. Marguerite Holloway heard in the first week of November. She heard from her husband Douglas, who had heard from Hank Delaney at the country club, who had heard from the county assessor, who had noticed that Lot 47 Riverbend Edition had been reassessed for property tax purposes at a value of $2,400,000, which was the best available proxy for what the land itself, stripped of the extraction value of the deposits, was now worth given the adjacent processing rights. The assessor had noticed this in a routine review and had mentioned it casually to Hank at a Rotary lunch. Hank had told Douglas. Douglas had told Marguerite. And Marguerite had come into the diner on a Tuesday in November and had sat in Delia's section and had waited for Delia to come take her order with a look on her face that Delia had never seen on her before, which was the look of a person who had just realized, very recently and very publicly, that she had been wrong about something for a long time. "Delia," Marguerite said, as Delia set down the menu. "Marguerite." Marguerite paused. Delia waited. The diner was half full. Janine was at the register. Frank was in the kitchen. The lunch crowd at the booth behind Marguerite stopped talking because they had all heard the same thing Marguerite had heard, and they were all waiting to see what Marguerite was going to do. Marguerite looked down at the menu. She looked back up. She said, "I owe you an apology." Delia said nothing. "I have," Marguerite continued, "been unkind to you for a long time. I have said things I should not have said, and I have said them in public, and I have been wrong, and I am sorry. I would like to apologize to you properly, not here, where everyone can hear. I would like to take you to lunch somewhere else, somewhere nicer, and apologize to you the way you deserve. But I also wanted you to know, in front of these people, that I am apologizing because I think they deserve to see me do it, given that they watched me do the other thing." Delia set the coffee carafe down on the counter. She looked at Marguerite for a long moment. Marguerite's face was composed, but her hands were shaking very slightly where she had rested them on the menu, and Delia realized, with a small shock, that Marguerite Holloway was not just apologizing because she had been proven wrong. Marguerite Holloway was apologizing because something in her, some small and stubborn piece of her that had survived 40 years of being the most powerful person in a small town, had been ashamed of herself for long enough that the opportunity to say so out loud was a relief. Delia had practiced, many times over the last 6 months, the speech she would give Marguerite Holloway when this moment came. She had rehearsed it in the truck and in the shower and in the walk-in cooler at the diner. She had imagined saying, "You laughed at me in a courthouse. You called my choices idiotic to my face. You mocked me in front of my son and my town and my dead husband's memory. And I am not going to forgive you. And I am not going to pretend this is a small thing. And you are going to sit with what you did." She had imagined saying all of it, every word, for months. On the post at the entrance, they mounted a brass plate that said Harlan Voss, 1931 to 2004, who knew what was in the ground. Reese had chosen the words himself. Delia had called Dr. Lund and asked if she could get a copy of the first page of Voss's journal framed behind glass, and Dr. Lund had said yes. And the framed page hung on the inside wall of the gazebo now, where anyone who walked up the rise could read Voss's first entry from 1963 about the Saint-Gaudens he had bought at the estate sale in Tacoma. Marguerite Holloway came to the dedication. She had asked, quietly, through Janine, whether it would be acceptable for her to attend, and Delia had said yes. There were maybe 20 people at the dedication. Marguerite stood at the back. She did not speak. At the end, as people were leaving, she walked up to Delia and put a hand on Delia's arm and said, "Delia, you made something beautiful out of this place. I wanted to tell you that." Delia had said, "Thank you, Marguerite," and Marguerite had walked back to her car. They were not friends. They would never be friends. But the weight of the thing between them had been set down, and that was enough. On a warm evening in early June, 2 years after she had paid $4 for Lot 47 of the Riverbend edition, Delia sat on the front porch of her new house with Reese beside her. He was 13 now. He had grown 3 inches over the winter. He had taken, over the spring, to reading in the evenings, books about geology that he had been finding at the public library in Henrik, and he had announced, 3 weeks ago, that he was thinking about becoming a hydrologist. Delia had not reacted. She had just said, "Your dad was a hydrologist," and Reese had said, "I know," and they had left it there. "Mom." "Yeah. Do you think Harlan would have liked us?" Delia thought about it. "I think," she said, "he would have looked at us and decided we were exactly the kind of people he built the chamber for. And then I think he would have made us both cups of coffee that were too strong, and we would have sat at his kitchen table and talked about dirt for 3 hours, and he would have told me I paid too much for the lot." Reese laughed. $4 was too much? He would have said it was exactly $3.99 too much, because it should have been given to us for free. Reese laughed again. He leaned back against the railing of the porch. The evening light was slanting low across the yard. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. A neighbor's sprinkler clicked on. "Mom." "Yeah, I'm glad we bought it." She reached over and put her hand on his shoulder. "Me too, bud." They sat on the porch until the light was gone, and the first stars came out over the roofs of the houses across the street. Delia thought about the deed, which she still kept, folded in quarters, inside the pocket of Cal's old denim jacket in the closet of her new bedroom. She thought about the clerk at the courthouse who had not met her eyes. She thought about Marguerite's laugh. She thought about the 4 quarters on the counter of the diner and the soil samples in the parking lot of the post office and the fence she had built with her own hands. She thought about Harlan Voss, dead for 22 years, and about a journal that began with a 1908 Saint-Gaudens and ended with an open invitation to a stranger. She thought about Cal, who had once told her that every flood was also a deposit, and about Reese, who was sitting next to her on the porch of a house they owned, in a town that had laughed at them, reading a book about groundwater. The ground had done its work. She had done hers. She went inside. She made Reese and herself 2 cups of hot chocolate, because they had both liked it when he was smaller and had started making it again, in the new house, as a thing they did together at night. She carried both mugs back out to the porch. She handed him his. They sat in the dark. The hot chocolate was too hot at first. They waited. They drank it slowly. The crickets started up in the grass beyond the porch. The stars kept coming out. Delia Vance sat on the porch of her own house, in the town of Crescent Hollow, with her son beside her, and she felt, at last, that she had kept her promise. The summer after the gazebo was built, a letter arrived. It came on a Tuesday in late July, slid into the mailbox of the house on the south side of town with the rest of the day's mail, a white envelope with a return address in Spokane, Washington. Delia carried the mail inside and set it on the kitchen counter and started a pot of coffee before she looked at it again. When she did look at it, she stopped with her hand halfway to the coffee mug and stood very still. The return address said Charles Voss. She sat down at the kitchen table. Reese was in his bedroom reading. Through the kitchen window, the afternoon light was slanting across the backyard and catching on the raised bed of tomatoes she had planted in May, her first garden in 5 years. She opened the envelope with her thumb. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper, folded twice. The handwriting was cramped but legible in blue ballpoint pen. "Dear Ms. Vance," it began. "My name is Charles Voss. I am the nephew of Harlan Voss, who owned the land you now own in Crescent Hollow. I hope you will forgive the intrusion of this letter. 3 weeks ago, a woman named Dr. Patricia Lund contacted me about a matter related to my late uncle's estate. She was kind and she was careful in what she told me. But the substance of what she told me is that you found something on the property that my uncle left behind, and that he left it with instructions suggesting he hoped it would be found by someone like you, and that you have been handling the matter with a care and grace that my uncle would have recognized as the right kind. I am not writing to ask for anything," the letter continued. "I want to be clear about that before I say anything else. My uncle and I were not close in his last years, for reasons that were mine more than his. I would like, if you would permit it, to come and see the place where he lived, just to stand on the ground. I understand completely if you would prefer that I not. I have no claim on the property, and I make no claim. I would only ask to walk the land and, if the gazebo Dr. Lund mentioned is accessible, to sit in it for an afternoon." Delia read the letter 3 times. She thought about it for 2 days. On the second night, she sat down at the small desk under the front window and wrote a reply. She did not say any of it. She said, "I accept your apology, Marguerite. Thank you. Do you want coffee?" Marguerite looked at her. Her eyes were very bright. "Yes, please." Delia poured the coffee. She took Marguerite's order, which was the grilled chicken salad, no croutons, dressing on the side. She walked the order back to Frank, and Frank looked up through the pass, and his eyes asked a question, and Delia shook her head very slightly, and Frank nodded and plated the salad clean. Delia brought it back out. Marguerite ate. She paid. She left a $30 tip on a $19 check. She walked out of the diner without looking back. Janine came up behind Delia at the counter. "You are a better person than I am," Janine said quietly. "No, I'm not," Delia said. "I just figured out that being right was enough. I didn't need to be right and angry at the same time." Janine put her arm around Delia's shoulder for a second and then went to clear Marguerite's table. Delia told Janine that night. She drove to Janine's house after her shift and sat at Janine's kitchen table and told her the whole story, from the soil report to the chamber to the collection to the deal that had closed 2 weeks earlier. She told her about the $108,000 that had hit her account in October and the first royalty check that was projected for next September and the written appraisal from Dr. Lund that had come back at $71 million on the conservative estimate. She told her about Cal and hydrology and pegmatites and about Harlan Voss's journal And about the moment she had stood at the bottom of the shaft and realized that a man she had never met had spent 40 years of his life saving something he had wanted her, or someone like her, to find. She told her everything. She cried. Janine cried. They drank 2 cups of coffee each and then a glass of wine each. And it was almost 2 in the morning when Delia drove home, and she slept for 4 hours and got up and went to the diner, because the habits of 3 years do not break in a single night, even when the reason for them has. She bought a house in December. It was not a big house. It was a 3-bedroom ranch on a quiet street on the south side of town, 4 blocks from Reese's school, with a small front yard and a bigger backyard and a garage that was full of the previous owner's tools because they had decided, in the closing negotiation, to leave the tools for her, which was the kind of gesture Crescent Hollow people sometimes made when they realized they liked the person they were selling to. She paid cash. The house cost $185,000. She moved in with Reese on December 18th. Karen helped them move. Janine helped them move. Frank helped them move. Pete did not help them move, but Pete was not the point. On the first night in the new house, Reese came into the kitchen where Delia was washing the 2 plates they had used for dinner, and he said, "Mom, can we go out to the lot? Now. It's dark." "Yeah, I just want to see it." She dried her hands. They drove out to Lot 47 in the Ranger. The fence was still there. The slab was still there. The plate over the shaft had been welded back into place after the collection was moved, and the earth had been graded over it, and the whole rise under the oak tree looked now the way it had looked for 20 years, unremarkable and ordinary. The stars were out. The crow and its mate were somewhere in the trees, asleep, and the Little Sable River moved quietly 50 yards to the east. Reese walked up the rise to the oak. He stood under it for a long time. Delia stayed at the truck. When he came back, he said, "I want to build a gazebo there. Like a nice one, with a roof, and a bench, and a sign that says Harlan's name on it, so that if anybody ever walks past they know somebody used to live here and that he mattered." Delia put her arm around her son. "Okay," she said. "We'll build it in the spring." They stood in the dark for a while, looking at nothing, and then they drove home. The winter passed. Delia kept working at the diner 3 days a week, mornings only, because she had found that she missed it when she did not go in, and because she had made Frank and Janine promise they would not let her quit entirely. She had stopped washing dishes at the riverside in November. Donnie had hugged her at the end of her last shift and told her she was the best damn dishwasher he had ever had. She had laughed. In April, almost exactly a year after she had bought the lot for $4, the first royalty check arrived. It was for $190,000. She deposited it. She wrote a check for $40,000 to the scholarship fund at the high school Reese would attend in 2 years, under the condition that it be named after Cal. She wrote a second check for $15,000 to the elementary school for new library books. She gave Janine and Frank each a bonus Christmas gift that was technically after Christmas, of $10,000 apiece. And when they tried to refuse, she told them she had simply decided they had been underpaid by the diner for a long time, and that she was correcting a historic error, which was not a gift and therefore could not be refused. Janine cried. Frank did not cry, but he hugged her, which was something Frank had never done in 22 years. She also called Meredith Aguilar and said, "I want to set up a fund, a small one, for something specific." Aguilar had said, "Tell me." Delia had said, "I want it to be available to people in small towns who think they see something in a piece of land that nobody else sees. I want it to pay for soil tests and lab fees and attorney consultations and title searches for people who are trying to figure out whether what they suspect is real. I want the grants to be small. I want them to be enough to let somebody like me, 3 years ago, actually go find out." Aguilar had been silent for a moment and had then said, "That is a very good idea. It would be my honor to help you set it up." Delia had funded it, initially, with $100,000, with a commitment to add to it every year from her royalty income. In May, she and Reese and Janine and Frank and Karen and a contractor named Mr. Delgado spent 3 Saturdays building a gazebo on the rise where Harlan Voss's house had stood. It was small, maybe 12 feet square, with a cedar shingle roof and an octagonal bench running around the inside. "Dear Mr. Voss," she wrote, "I would be glad to have you come. The gazebo is there, and the land is there, and it is your uncle's land before it was ever mine, in the way that matters. My son Reese is 13, and he has read parts of your uncle's journal and has thought about him probably more than any 13-year-old ought to think about a man who has been dead since before he was born. I think Reese would also like to meet you. Charles Voss arrived on a Friday afternoon in the middle of August. He drove a 15-year-old Subaru, and he pulled up in front of Delia's house at 3:47. He was a thin man in his early 50s, with gray hair and a closely trimmed gray beard, and he was dressed in the kind of clothing that suggested he had thought carefully that morning about what to wear. He took off his shoes at the door without being asked. He shook Reese's hand and said, "You must be Reese," and Reese said, "Yes, sir," and Charles said, "Please don't call me sir, my uncle would have kicked me for it." They sat at the kitchen table. For a minute, none of them spoke. Then Charles said, "My uncle was a difficult man to be close to. He was kind, and he was decent, and he would drive 11 hours to help you if you were in trouble. But he did not talk about himself, and he did not explain himself. When he was 12, his mother died, and he did not speak for 4 months. He was not in distress. He had simply decided there was nothing worth saying for 4 months, and so he said nothing. That was Harlan." Delia smiled. "I want you to understand," Charles said, "that the reason I did not contact you for any portion of what you found is not that I am making a gesture. It is that I do not need it, and I know I did not earn it, and my uncle did not leave it for me." Delia looked down at her coffee. She looked back up. "I am glad you told me," she said, "but there is something I want to tell you too. My attorney and I have been thinking for 8 months about what to do with the collection. We have decided the majority of it will remain intact, in a trust, with Dr. Lund and 2 other numismatists as stewards. The trust will eventually place selected pieces on long-term loan to institutions, including the American Numismatic Society and the Spokane Public Library, which was one of the 2 institutions your uncle designated in his journal as places he would like his collection remembered." Charles closed his eyes for a moment. "I did not know that," he said quietly. "It is in the last entry. He wrote that if anyone asked where his collection came from, the answer should be, a man who loved a city he did not live in, and a town he loved more than he had ever said. The city was Spokane. The town was Crescent Hollow." Charles pressed his fingertips against his closed eyes. He took a moment. He lowered his hand. "There is one more thing," Delia said. "My attorney and I have set up a fund. It is called the Voss Fund. It gives small grants to people in small towns who believe they have found something in a piece of land that other people have dismissed and who need the money to find out whether they are right. I would like, if you are willing, to name you as a member of the advisory board." Charles looked at her. "Me? You knew him?" "Not as well as I should have. That is a qualification, Mr. Voss. Not a disqualification." He laughed. It was a small, surprised laugh, the laugh of a man who had not expected to laugh today. "I would be honored," he said. They drove out to the lot in the Ranger. When they turned onto the county road, Charles said, quietly, "He used to drive me out here in the summers when I was a boy. He would wake me up at 5 in the morning and take me to the river to fish. He never caught anything. He was a terrible fisherman, but he liked being there." They parked by the slab. Charles walked up the rise to the gazebo. He stood at the entrance and looked at the brass plate for a long time, and then he took off his shoes and left them at the step and walked in barefoot on the cedar boards. He sat on the bench inside. He stayed there for a long time. He came back down the rise after about 40 minutes. He sat on the tailgate of the Ranger next to Delia. Reese had wandered off toward the river. "He would have liked that you were the one who found it," Charles said. "I think I would have liked him." "Yes, you would have. He was difficult, but he was worth the trouble." Janine came over to make dinner that night, because Delia had called her from the truck and Janine had said, "I'm already on my way." Frank came too. At one point, after the lasagna, Charles stood up. "I would like to say something," he said. "My uncle built something out here that he never talked about. He built it, and he buried it, and he left it in the hope that someone he would never meet would eventually come and find it. He was a lonely man in a particular way, where he was not unhappy with being alone, but where he wanted, underneath it all, to be known by somebody in a way he could not quite let himself be known in his lifetime." Charles looked at Delia. "You are the person he was waiting for." He would not have said it. He would have written a letter that was very dry and very formal. But I am going to say it for him. Delia looked down at her plate. Janine reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Frank cleared his throat and looked at the ceiling, and Reese stared into his water glass very hard without blinking. "Thank you, Charles," Delia said. He left at 9:30 to drive to the bed and breakfast in Henrik. At the door, He took Delia's hand. "I am going to come back," he said, "once a year. I would like to keep coming. Please do." Later, after everyone had gone and Reese had fallen asleep on the couch with a book open on his chest, Delia carried him to his bed the way she had carried him when he was small, although he was nearly as tall as she was now. She stood in the doorway and watched him breathe, and then she closed his door softly and went to the kitchen. On the table, underneath the stack of afternoon mail, was another envelope she had not opened. It was smaller, with a handwritten address in a careful, nervous script, forwarded from the post office box the Voss fund used. She sat down and opened it. "Dear Ms. Vance," it began. "My name is Reba Holloway. Although I understand that name might be unfortunate for you, I am no relation to the Holloways of your town. I am a woman of 41 in Clay County, West Virginia, a single mother of 2 girls, and I work as an aide at a nursing home. I am writing to the Voss Fund because I read about it in a magazine article, and I am writing to you because the article said that you had been in a situation not entirely unlike mine 3 years ago, before you found what you found. I inherited 41 acres from my grandmother in 2023, the letter continued. My cousins tell me to sell it to the gas company. But my grandmother told me, before she died, that there was something on that land her father had known about, and that nobody was willing to tell her what it was, only that she should not sell it. I have walked every inch of it. I have no training, and I have no money. I read the article, and I wondered if there was any chance that someone like you might be able to help me figure out how to ask the right question. I am writing this letter in the kitchen at 11 at night, and my girls are asleep, and I do not know if I will even mail it in the morning. But if I do, I want you to know that I have thought about you every day since I read that article." The letter was signed, "With great respect, Reba Holloway." Delia read it twice. Then she got up and walked to the window over the sink and looked out at the dark backyard. The crickets were loud in the tomato bed. She walked back to the table. She pulled out a piece of stationery. She uncapped a pen. "Dear Mrs. Holloway," she wrote, "thank you for your letter. I have read it twice. I believe I can help you, and the fund can help you. And I would like to start by sending you a small grant of $4,000, which is what I estimate you will need to begin. I have enclosed a list of the steps I took when I began, 3 years ago, to find out what my own piece of land contained. I am also including the name of an attorney in Boise, Idaho, who has agreed to speak with anyone the fund refers to her, at no initial cost. I want to say one more thing," Delia wrote. "I am no one to give advice about patience, but I will tell you what I learned, which is that the ground does not care whether anybody else believes you. The ground keeps its own records. You do not have to convince anyone of what you suspect. You only have to do the work of finding out. Everything else comes after." She signed her name. She sealed the letter. She set it on the counter where she would see it in the morning. In the hallway, she stopped outside Reese's closed door and listened to him breathe. Then she went to her own bedroom, and she took Cal's denim jacket out of the closet, and she put her hand in the inside pocket where she still kept the deed to Lot 47, folded in quarters the way it had been folded on the day she had bought it for $4. She held the jacket for a minute. She put it back. She turned out the light. In the morning, she mailed the letter on her way to the diner. She worked her shift. She came home. She made Reese dinner. She sat on the porch in the evening with a cup of hot chocolate and watched the light move across the yard, and she thought about all the people in all the small towns who were sitting at their own kitchen tables at 11 at night, writing letters they were not sure they would ever mail, about pieces of land that nobody else believed in. She thought about how many of them there probably were. She thought about how many letters the fund would receive, eventually, once word got out. She thought about Harlan Voss, who had built a chamber in 1999 and had waited 22 years for somebody to read his journal. She thought about her son, who was going to be a hydrologist. She thought about the ground under her feet, which was the ground of a town that had laughed at her, and which she loved anyway, and which had, in the end, done exactly what she had known it would do. She finished her hot chocolate. She went inside. She washed the mug. She turned off the lights, one by one, through the rooms of the house she owned, and she went to bed. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.